Chapter 1. The Weight of Silence. The November morning was cruel in its ordinary beauty. Frost clung to the hedgerows along the lane leading into Godric's hollow, and the weak sun cast long shadows that reminded Remus Lupin of fingers reaching toward something just out of grasp. He could have turned back. It would have been easy. Catch the next train to London. Find a room somewhere far from here. Far from the weight of what he'd lost. But something pulled him forward along the cobblestone path, past the war memorial and the church, toward the cottage that no longer held the people he'd loved most. The apparition had left him dizzy and hollow. 3 days since the owl had found him in Newcastle. 3 days since he'd learned that James and Lily Potter were dead. Or 3 days of travelling south through a Britain that didn't know the war was over, where people still jumped at shadows and spoke in whispers about you-know-who. They would learn soon enough that their nightmare had ended on Halloween night. But for Remus, walking toward the ruins of his friend's last sanctuary, it felt like his was just beginning. The cottage stood at the end of a quiet lane, or what remained of it. The upper floor had collapsed entirely. Timbers scattered across the garden, like the bones of some great beast. The front wall gaped open, exposing rooms that had once held laughter and warmth and the soft sounds of a family building their life together. Remus stopped at the garden gate, his fingers tight around the cold iron, and tried to reconcile the destruction before him with his last memory of this place. James grinning as he showed off the vegetable garden he'd planted for Lily, Harry balanced on his hip, grabbing at his father's glasses. That had been in August, 3 months ago, a lifetime. The ministry had been here already. He could see the signs of their work in the careful way the debris had been arranged, the small numbered markers they'd left behind. But they'd been looking for evidence of dark magic, for traces of the Dark Lord's presence. They wouldn't have been looking for the things that mattered to the people who had lived here, the small, hidden pieces of a life that love had built and loss had shattered. Remus stepped through the broken gate and picked his way across the garden. Glass crunched under his feet from the blown-out windows. A child's toy broomstick lay half buried under a fallen beam, and he had to stop, had to close his eyes, and breathe through the sharp twist of pain that sight brought. When he opened them again, he forced himself to keep moving. The front door hung at an odd angle, one hinge torn away. Inside, the sitting room was a chaos of overturned furniture and scattered books. Lily's books, most of them. She'd always been the one to fill their shelves, while James complained good-naturedly about running out of space. Remus crouched beside a pile of volumes and ran his fingers along familiar spines. Defensive Magical Theory. A Guide to Advanced Transfiguration. The Healer's Handbook. All things she'd studied with the fierce determination that had made her one of the most formidable witches of their generation. But something about the arrangement nagged at him. The books weren't scattered randomly. They'd been moved, searched through. The ministry, perhaps, or... He frowned and stood, looking around the room with new eyes. There were signs everywhere once he knew to look for them. Drawers pulled open and contents rifled through. Cushions displaced. Even the pictures on the walls had been moved, as if someone had been looking for something hidden behind them. But who would have searched the house before the ministry arrived? Who else would have known to come here, would have had the time? The basement stairs were intact, though they creaked ominously under his weight. Below, the stone foundation had held against whatever magic had torn through the upper floors. It was dark and cold, and Remus had to light his wand to see properly. The basement was small, mostly used for storage, old furniture draped in sheets, boxes of books that hadn't fit upstairs, Christmas decorations Lily had been saving for Harry's first proper Christmas. He was turning to leave when something caught his eye. One of the stones in the far wall looked different from the others, slightly displaced, as if it had been recently moved. Remus approached it slowly, running his fingers along the edges. It was loose, definitely loose, and when he worked it free, he found a small cavity behind it. Inside was a leather-bound journal, wrapped in what felt like silk. Remus pulled it out with trembling hands. The leather was warm to the touch, and he could feel the faint hum of magic around it. Protection charms, but gentle ones, personal ones. He recognized Lily's magical signature immediately, nor as distinct as her laugh had been. The journal fell open in his hands to a page near the back, and her handwriting swam before his eyes. October 30th, 1981. Dumbledore came again today. He's asking us to do something that feels wrong. James won't hear it, but I can see the doubt in his eyes when he thinks I'm not looking. We've done everything he's asked, taken every mission, made every sacrifice he's deemed necessary for the Order. But this... I keep thinking about what Mum used to say about people who claim to know what's best for everyone else. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, Lily girl, but it's built by people who never ask if the ones walking it want to be there. I don't want to walk this road anymore. I don't want Harry walking it either. But what choice do we have? And Dumbledore says the prophecy. The entry ended there, the ink smudged as if she'd been interrupted, or as if she'd stopped herself from writing something she wasn't ready to put into words. Remus sank down onto an overturned crate, the journal clutched against his chest. His hands were shaking, and not just from the cold. Lily had kept a diary. All this time, through everything they'd done for the Order, everything they'd sacrificed, she'd been writing it down. And if this entry was any indication, she'd been having doubts about Dumbledore that she'd never shared with anyone. Not even James. Not even him. He turned the page with careful fingers, looking for more recent entries, but found only blank parchment. Whatever she'd written after October 30th had either been destroyed in the attack or had never been written at all. The thought that her life had ended before she could finish expressing her doubts, her fears, made his throat tight. But there were earlier entries, months of them, judging by the thickness of the pages he hadn't yet read. Months of Lily's private thoughts during some of the darkest days of the war. Months of observations and concerns and questions that might explain why she'd been worried about Dumbledore's demands. Remus closed the journal and stood, slipping it inside his robes. Whatever secrets it contained, whatever doubts Lily had harbored, he needed to understand them. She'd hidden this for a reason, protected it with her own magic, and trusted that someone would find it. Someone who cared enough to look beyond the obvious, to search for the truth beneath the tragedy. Or the weight of it settled against his ribs like a second heartbeat as he climbed the basement stairs and stepped back into the ruined sitting room. The November light seemed harsher now, throwing the destruction into sharp relief. This wasn't just the aftermath of a battle between good and evil, between the light and the dark. This was the remains of a home where two people had loved each other, where they'd planned for their son's future, where they'd tried to build something worth protecting. And according to Lily's own words, their leader, the man they'd trusted with their lives and their son's safety, had been asking them to do something that felt wrong. Remus looked around the destroyed room one more time, memorizing details he hadn't noticed before. The way the furniture had been overturned, the pattern of the damage, yet the careful way someone had searched through their belongings before the ministry arrived. Then he turned and walked out of the cottage, Lily's journal burning like a coal against his chest, carrying secrets that might change everything he thought he knew about the war they'd just lost, and the man who'd led them through it. Behind him, the ruins of Godric's Hollow stood silent in the morning light, keeping their own secrets close. But some secrets, Remus was beginning to understand, were meant to be uncovered. Some truths were meant to be told, no matter how much they might hurt the people who needed to hear them. The weight of Lily's journal pressed against his ribs as he walked back down the lane, away from what had been and toward whatever came next. He had reading to do, questions to ask, and a truth to uncover that might be more terrible than any of them had imagined. But for James and Lily, for the memory of what they'd meant to him and what they'd died trying to protect, he would carry that weight as long as it took to understand what had really happened on Halloween night. The November morning was still beautiful, still cruel in its ordinariness. But Remus Lupin was no longer the same man who'd walked into Godric's Hollow an hour before. He was someone who carried secrets now, someone who had questions that needed answers, and he was someone who was beginning to suspect that the war might not be as over as everyone believed. Chapter 2. The Pattern Emerges. Remus found himself in a small inn 3 villages over from Godric's Hollow, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. The other patrons, farmers mostly, and a few travelling merchants, paid him no attention. He was just another worn-looking man trying to disappear into the corners of a world that had recently been at war. Perfect. Lily's diary lay closed on the scarred wooden table before him, and he'd been staring at it for the better part of an hour, working up the courage to read more. The October 30th entry had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. The idea that Lily had harboured serious doubts about Dumbledore, that she'd been questioning their leader's judgment in the final days of the war, it challenged everything Remus thought he knew about the Order, about the choices they'd all made. But if there were earlier entries, as the thickness of the journal suggested, then perhaps he could understand how those doubts had developed. Perhaps he could piece together what had really been happening behind the closed doors of Order leadership, while foot soldiers like himself carried out missions in the dark. With trembling fingers, he opened the diary several pages back and found an entry dated in September. September 15th, 1981. Dumbledore was here again today, and I'm starting to dread the sound of his footsteps on our garden path. He wants James to take another mission, something involving Death Eater safe houses in Wales. Dangerous work, the kind that requires someone who can think quickly under pressure. James has a particular talent for these operations, he said, and I watched James straighten with pride. But I'm 8 months pregnant. 8 months, and Dumbledore wants to send my husband into a situation where he might not come back. When I pointed this out, gently, diplomatically, the way we've all learned to speak to him, he just gave me that infuriating smile. My dear Lily, the war will not pause for domestic concerns. James understands his duty. Domestic concerns? As if our child is nothing more than an inconvenience to his grand strategy. James agreed to go, of course. He always does. But afterward, when we were alone, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not doubt, exactly, but fatigue, as if he's growing tired of being Dumbledore's perfect soldier. I wonder if the others feel it too, this sense that we're pieces on a board, being moved by someone who sees the whole game while we stumble around in the dark. Remus lowered the journal, his chest tight. He remembered that mission. James had been gone for nearly 2 weeks, and when he'd returned, he'd looked haggard, older somehow. Remus had attributed it to the stress of combat, to the natural wear of fighting a war. He'd never considered that James might have been questioning whether the mission was worth the risk, whether leaving his heavily pregnant wife was truly necessary for the greater good. How many other signs had he missed? How many times had his friends tried to express doubts that he'd been too loyal, too trusting to hear? He turned back a few more pages. August 22nd, 1981. We're moving again. Dumbledore says our current safe house has been compromised, though he won't say how he knows. Trust me, he says, as if trust is something we can afford to give blindly anymore. The new location is Godric's Hollow. I asked why there, specifically. It's not exactly hidden, is it? Famous village. Historical significance. The sort of place people visit. If we're trying to disappear, why not somewhere truly remote? Godric's Hollow has certain protective qualities, was all he would say. Harry will be safest there. Harry. Always Harry. I'm starting to notice how often Dumbledore's plans seem to revolve around our son, how his eyes linger on Harry when he visits, as if he's cataloguing something. James says I'm being paranoid, that Dumbledore is just concerned for Harry's welfare. But I keep thinking about the way he phrased it. Not your family will be safest there. Not even you will be safest there. Just Harry. What is it about our son that makes Dumbledore so interested? The teacup slipped in Remus's grip, and he had to catch it before it fell. Lily had questioned the move to Godric's Hollow. She'd noticed Dumbledore's particular focus on Harry had been disturbed by it. And Remus, who had prided himself on being observant, on being a good friend who paid attention to the people he cared about, had missed it entirely. How much had he not seen? How much had all of them not seen? He flipped back further, looking for the beginning of whatever pattern Lily had started to recognize. July 8th, 1981. Harry's first birthday was yesterday. We had a small celebration, just us, since we couldn't risk inviting anyone to the safe house. James made a cake that collapsed on one side, and Harry got more frosting on himself than in his mouth. For a few hours we almost felt normal. Then Dumbledore arrived. He didn't come to wish Harry happy birthday, though he made a show of admiring the mess our son had made with his cake. No, he came to discuss Harry's future role in our struggle. Those were his exact words. I asked what he meant. Harry is barely a year old. What role could he possibly have? There are prophecies, my dear Lily. Ancient magic that speaks to the nature of destiny itself. I cannot share the details for everyone's safety, but I can tell you that your son may be more important to this war than any of us initially understood. James went very still at that. Important how? He asked. That remains to be seen. But we must be prepared for all possibilities. The choices we make now may determine not just the outcome of this war, but the shape of the world our children inherit. He left after that, but not before making it clear that our cooperation in future endeavors was expected. Not requested. Expected. I keep replaying that conversation in my mind, the way he looked at Harry, not with the fond affection of a grandfather figure, but with the calculating gaze of someone appraising a valuable asset. And the prophecy he mentioned. Why won't he tell us what it says? If it concerns our son, don't we have a right to know? James thinks I'm overthinking it. Dumbledore has always been secretive, he says. It's how he's kept us all alive this long. But secrets can be weapons too, and I'm starting to wonder who they're really aimed at. Remus had to close the diary and press his palms against his eyes. A prophecy about Harry, and Dumbledore had known about it since at least July, had been planning Harry's role in the war since the boy was barely a year old. The implications made his stomach turn. Or Harry was 15 months old now, assuming he'd survived whatever had happened after his parents' deaths. Just a toddler. And according to Lily's entries, Dumbledore had been treating him like a strategic resource for months. What kind of prophecy involved a child? What kind of leader made plans around putting a baby in danger? He opened the journal again, looking for more, and found an entry that made his blood run cold. June 14th, 1981. I told Dumbledore today that we should consider leaving Britain entirely. James has contacts in America, other expatriates who left when the war got too dangerous. We could disappear completely, raise Harry somewhere safe, away from all of this. I've never seen Dumbledore angry before. Not truly angry. Oh, he's been stern with us, disappointed when missions went poorly, but this was something else entirely. That is not an option, he said, and his voice was like winter. Your son has obligations that transcend personal safety. Destiny cannot be fled from, Lily. It must be embraced. I asked him what destiny he was talking about. What obligations could a 10-month-old baby possibly have? He wouldn't answer. But as he was leaving, he paused at the door and said something that's been haunting me for hours. Harry Potter will face Tom Riddle eventually. The only question is whether he'll be prepared for it or not. I would prefer he be prepared. face Tom Riddle, our baby son, facing the Dark Lord himself. James hasn't spoken to me since I told him what Dumbledore said. I think he's afraid that if we talk about it, we'll have to admit that we've been following a madman. But what choice do we have? Where can we run that Dumbledore won't find us? How do we protect Harry from a destiny that was apparently chosen for him before he could even walk? Sometimes I think the only difference between Dumbledore and Voldemort is that Dumbledore believes his own propaganda about the greater good. Remus stared at the final line until the words blurred together. The only difference between Dumbledore and Voldemort. Lily, brilliant, compassionate, fiercely moral Lily, had written those words about the man they'd all trusted with their lives, and she'd written them months before her death. He thought about the October 30th entry, about Dumbledore asking them to do something that felt wrong. In light of these earlier entries, that request took on a different weight. Not the desperate plea of a leader trying to win an impossible war, but the calculated manipulation of parents who'd already been pushed to their breaking point. The inn around him felt suddenly stifling. Remus closed the journal and left money on the table, then walked outside into the crisp November air. The afternoon was growing late, and the sky had that particular quality of light that came just before winter truly set in. He needed time to think, to process what he'd read. But more than that, he needed to understand the scope of what Lily had documented. How far back did her doubts go? How many other Order members had been manipulated the way she and James had been? How many of them were still alive to hear the truth? And what had become of Harry, the child whose destiny had apparently been planned by a man who saw 15-month-old babies as weapons in his war? Remus began walking, not toward any particular destination, just moving because sitting still felt impossible. Lily's words echoed in his mind, painting a picture of their final months that was nothing like what he'd imagined. Not heroes dying for a noble cause, but parents trapped by a leader who'd convinced them they had no choice but to sacrifice everything, including their son, for his vision of the greater good. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. But according to Lily's diary, the real fight, the fight for Harry Potter's life and freedom, might just be beginning, and Dumbledore, it seemed, intended to win it by any means necessary. Chapter 3. The Prophecy's Shadow. The small room Remus had rented above the inn felt like a cage as evening settled over the countryside. He'd been reading for hours now, and Lily's diary lay open before him on the narrow desk, bathed in the wavering light of a single candle. Outside, he could hear the ordinary sounds of a village at rest, shutters closing, voices calling good night across garden fences, the distant lowing of cattle settling for the night. Normal sounds. Peaceful sounds. The sounds of a world that didn't know how close it had come to losing everything. But inside this room, surrounded by the evidence of Lily's growing desperation and fear, peace felt like a luxury Remus could no longer afford. He'd been working backward through the diary, watching the progression of Lily's doubts in reverse, as each entry painted a picture of a woman growing more isolated, more frightened, not just of the war that raged around them, but of the man who was supposed to be protecting her family. And as the months rolled back, the pattern became more disturbing, not less. The entry he'd just found was dated May 18th, 1981, and his hands had been shaking as he read it. May 18th, 1981. I know what the prophecy says now. Not all of it. I only caught fragments, but enough to understand why Dumbledore has been watching Harry the way he does. Why he gets that calculating look whenever our son is mentioned. I was early for the meeting today. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall were already in the safe house's kitchen, speaking in low voices. They thought I was still upstairs with Harry, putting him down for his nap. I suppose I should have announced myself, should have made some noise to let them know I was there. Instead, I listened. The Potter child's destiny grows heavier each day, Professor McGonagall was saying. She sounded tired, older than I'd ever heard her. Are you certain there's no other interpretation? No other way? The prophecy is quite specific, Minerva. A child born as the 7th month dies, born to those who have thrice defied him. The power to vanquish the Dark Lord, but at what cost? Dumbledore's voice trailed off, and I heard the clink of a teacup being set down. The boy must be prepared for what's coming. There's no avoiding it. He's not even a year old, Albus. Surely we have time. Time is precisely what we lack. Every day Tom grows stronger, more desperate. Or every day brings us closer to the moment when Harry Potter must fulfill his purpose. I pressed myself against the wall outside the kitchen, my heart hammering so loud I was sure they would hear it. Fulfill his purpose. As if Harry were a tool to be used, not a child to be protected. And if he doesn't survive it? Professor McGonagall asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed lasted so long, I thought they'd discovered me. Then Dumbledore spoke, and his words turned my blood to ice. Then he will have died as a hero, and the wizarding world will remember him as such. But I believe, I must believe, that there is a way for him to live through what must be done. I simply haven't found it yet. I left without announcing myself. I couldn't face either of them, not after hearing that. Not after learning that the man I'd trusted with my family's safety was planning my son's martyrdom. Harry is 9 months old, he can barely walk, and Dumbledore is already planning the moment he'll die for the greater good. Remus had to stop reading and lean back in his chair, closing his eyes against the wave of nausea that swept through him. A prophecy that required Harry's death. Dumbledore planning for it, preparing for it, accepting it as inevitable. And Lily, discovering that the man she'd followed into war was treating her baby like a weapon to be wielded when the time was right. The worst part was the matter-of-fact way Dumbledore had discussed it. Not with grief or reluctance, but with the calm calculation of a general planning a necessary sacrifice. 'Twas as if Harry's life were just another variable in an equation that had to balance. He forced himself to turn back a few pages, looking for the beginning of whatever investigation had led Lily to eavesdrop on that conversation. May 3rd, 1981. I've been reading everything I can find about prophecies and divination. James thinks I'm developing an academic interest. But the truth is that I'm terrified. The way Dumbledore looks at Harry, the way he talks about our son's importance to the cause, it all points to something specific, something he's not telling us. The books in the Safe House library are limited, but I found a volume on the nature of prophetic magic that's been enlightening. According to the author, true prophecies are binding in the sense that they reveal possibilities, not certainties, and the future can be shaped by the choices people make, even when those choices seem predetermined. But here's what troubles me. Many of the historical prophecies the book discusses involve children. Specifically, children who were treated as vessels for destiny rather than individuals with agency of their own. The chosen ones, they're called, and their stories rarely end well. I keep thinking about the way Dumbledore phrased it when he told us about Harry's importance. Your son may be more important to this war than any of us initially understood. Not that he might help end the war, that he might be the end of the war. What if we're not protecting Harry from Voldemort? What if we're preparing him for Voldemort? The thought makes me sick, but I can't shake it. And if I'm right, if that's what Dumbledore has planned for our son, then James and I need to find another way. There has to be another way. Remus rubbed his eyes, trying to process what he was reading. Lily had been conducting her own research into prophecies, trying to understand what Dumbledore was planning for Harry, and she'd reached a conclusion that terrified her, that Harry wasn't being protected from the war so much as prepared for it. The entry that followed was even more disturbing. April 22nd, 1981. I confronted Dumbledore today. I couldn't help myself. The way he'd been talking about Harry, the constant references to destiny and importance, and the role our son would play in ending the war, I had to know what he meant. I waited until James was out on a mission. I knew he wouldn't approve of me questioning Dumbledore directly, and I needed answers more than I needed peace in my marriage. "What exactly do you expect Harry to do?" I asked him. We were sitting in the front room of the safe house, Harry playing with wooden blocks on the carpet between us. "He's 8 months old. How can a baby be important to ending a war?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, watching Harry stack blocks with the intense focus only babies can manage. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than usual, but there was steel underneath it. "There are forces at work here larger than any of us, Lily. Ancient magic, old promises, debts that must be paid. Your son carries within him the power to destroy Tom Riddle, but that power will require sacrifice to unlock." "What kind of sacrifice?" I asked, though I think I already knew. "The kind that heroes make," he said simply. "'Tis the kind that saves the world." I picked Harry up then, held him close while he babbled and reached for my hair. He smelled like the baby soap I'd been hoarding since before the war, like innocence and trust and everything good that still existed in the world. "He's not a hero," I told Dumbledore. "He's my son, and I won't let you turn him into a martyr for your cause." For a moment, something dangerous flickered in Dumbledore's eyes, something cold and implacable that reminded me why dark wizards feared him. Then it was gone, hidden behind that grandfatherly smile that everyone trusted. "I understand your concerns, my dear. Any mother would feel as you do. But sometimes the needs of the many must outweigh the desires of the few. Harry Potter has a destiny, whether we wish it or not. We can either help him prepare for it, or we can watch him stumble into it unprepared." After he left, I held Harry for hours, rocking him while he slept, thinking about the choice Dumbledore had presented: prepare my son for martyrdom, or watch him die anyway without warning. But there's a third option he didn't mention, one I'm starting to think might be our only real choice. We could run. The candle flame flickered in a draught from the ill-fitted window, casting dancing shadows across the page. Remus stared at the word "run" until it seemed to blur and reshape itself into accusations, into all the times he'd believed in Dumbledore's wisdom, all the times he'd followed orders without question, all the times he'd trusted that their leader knew best. Lily had seen through it. Months before her death, she'd recognized that Dumbledore was planning to sacrifice Harry, and she'd been making plans to prevent it. The move to Godric's Hollow, the arguments about the secret keeper, the growing tension that everyone had attributed to the stress of being in hiding, it had all been part of Lily's desperate attempt to protect her son from the man who was supposed to be protecting them. He turned the page looking for more, and found an entry that made his stomach clench with dread. April 8th, 1981. I think Dumbledore has been planning this from the beginning. Not just planning to use Harry when the time comes, planning the entire war around the moment when our son would have to face Voldemort. I've been thinking about the timing. Harry was born in July 1980. The war had been going on for years by then, but it escalated dramatically in the months after his birth. More raids, more battles, more pressure on all of us to make increasingly dangerous choices, as if someone were deliberately pushing events toward a climax. And then there's the prophecy Dumbledore mentioned. If it's as specific as he claims, if it really does name Harry as the only one who can defeat the Dark Lord, then when was it made? How long has Dumbledore known that my son would have to die for his cause? I asked Professor McGonagall about it when she visited last week. Carefully, indirectly, the way you have to ask questions when you're starting to doubt the people you're supposed to trust. She let slip that the prophecy was made before Harry was born, which means Dumbledore has known about Harry's supposed destiny since before I was even showing. Has he been manipulating events all along? Or engineering situations to ensure that Harry would be in the right place at the right time to fulfill whatever dark purpose the prophecy outlined? James would say, "I'm being paranoid." He'd tell me that Dumbledore has always been secretive, that it's how he's managed to keep us alive this long. But what if he's not keeping us alive? What if he's keeping Harry alive just long enough to serve his purpose? I feel like I'm drowning in questions I'm afraid to ask out loud. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. I will not let my son become a sacrifice on Dumbledore's altar of the greater good. Whatever it takes, I'll find another way. Remus closed the diary, with hands that shook too badly to turn another page. The candle had burned low, and wax was pooling on the desk around its base, but he barely noticed. That all he could see was the progression of Lily's entries, the growing desperation of a mother who'd realized that the man she'd trusted to protect her family was actually planning to destroy it. And she'd been right. Whatever had happened on Halloween night, whatever had brought Voldemort to Godric's Hollow, it had ended exactly as Dumbledore had planned. James and Lily dead, Harry left to face the Dark Lord alone, the prophecy fulfilled in blood and sacrifice. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. And somewhere in the world, a 15-month-old boy was growing up in whatever circumstances Dumbledore had arranged for him, being shaped for whatever role the old wizard had decided he should play next. But Lily's diary proved that there had been another way. She'd seen it, had been planning for it, had been willing to defy Dumbledore and the entire Order to protect her son from a destiny that had been chosen for him before he could even speak. Remus stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful village below. Somewhere out there, Harry Potter was living the life Dumbledore had designed for him, a life that, if Lily's suspicions were correct, was just another stage in a plan that would eventually require the boy to sacrifice himself for the wizarding world. Unless someone stopped it. Unless someone finished what Lily had started. Remus turned back to the diary, his jaw set with new resolve. He had more reading to do, more evidence to gather, more questions to find answers for. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear as he worked his way through Lily's desperate documentation of Dumbledore's manipulation. For the war might be over, but the fight for Harry Potter's life was just beginning. And this time, Remus intended to be on the right side. Chapter 4. The Secret Keeper's Dilemma. Dawn was breaking over the countryside when Remus finally reached the final entries in Lily's diary. He'd been reading through the night, sustained by cups of increasingly bitter tea and a growing sense of dread that seemed to settle deeper into his bones with each page. The candle had burned down to nothing hours ago, and now pale morning light filtered through the inn's grimy windows, casting everything in shades of grey that seemed appropriate for what he was discovering. The last few entries were different from the others. Where Lily's earlier writing had been thoughtful, analytical, sometimes angry but always controlled, that these final pages carried an urgency that made Remus's hands shake as he turned them. These were the words of a woman who knew time was running out, who sensed that the trap she'd been trying to avoid was finally closing around her family. The entry dated October 20th made his blood run cold. October 20th, 1981. Dumbledore came today with his final demand. Not a request, not a suggestion, a demand. We're to go under the Fidelius charm immediately, and Sirius is to be our secret keeper. No discussion, no alternatives, no consideration for what James and I might prefer. The situation has become untenable, he said, standing in our kitchen as if he owned it, as if our entire lives were his to arrange. Tom's forces are closing in. We have perhaps days before they locate this safe house. The Fidelius charm is your only protection now. James started to agree immediately. Of course he did. Sirius is his best friend, the obvious choice. They've trusted each other with everything since they were 11 years old. But something in Dumbledore's manner, in the way he watched James's reaction, made me uneasy. Why Sirius specifically? I asked. Peter or Remus could serve as secret keeper just as well. Peter, especially. No one would suspect him. The look Dumbledore gave me was sharp enough to cut glass. Sirius Black is the logical choice, the most powerful of your friends, the most capable of defending the secret if it comes to that. Surely you can see the wisdom in selecting the strongest protector? But that's exactly what bothers me. If Sirius is the logical choice, what if everyone would expect him to be our secret keeper? Then wouldn't that make him the first target? Wouldn't the Death Eaters focus their efforts on him? I didn't voice these thoughts, not with Dumbledore watching me like a hawk watches a mouse. But I can't shake the feeling that he wants Sirius chosen for reasons that have nothing to do with our protection. After Dumbledore left, James and I talked for hours. He's convinced that Sirius is our best option, that his skill and loyalty make him the obvious choice. And maybe James is right. Maybe I'm seeing plots and conspiracies where there are only difficult decisions made in desperate times. But I keep thinking about the prophecy, about Dumbledore's plans for Harry's destiny. What if the Fidelius charm isn't meant to protect us at all? What if it's meant to ensure we're found at exactly the right moment? What if Dumbledore is counting on Sirius being captured or broken or turned? Remus had to set the diary down and press his palms against his eyes. The room felt like it was spinning, and not from exhaustion. Lily had suspected that Dumbledore wanted Sirius chosen as secret keeper because he could be compromised, because his capture or betrayal would lead Voldemort directly to them. She'd seen it, had questioned it, had been afraid that they were walking into a trap disguised as protection. And she'd been right. He forced himself to continue reading, even though every instinct screamed at him to stop, to close the diary and pretend he'd never found it. October 21st, 1981. I've been researching the Fidelius charm, was trying to understand exactly how it works and what its weaknesses might be. The books in our small library are limited, but I found enough to disturb me greatly. The charm is indeed powerful protection when it works as intended. But it has a fatal flaw. It's only as strong as the person holding the secret. If the secret keeper is compromised through torture, coercion, or betrayal, the protection collapses entirely. Not gradually, not partially, but completely and immediately. More troubling, the charm seems to create a kind of magical resonance between the secret keeper and the protected location. Advanced practitioners of dark magic, practitioners like Voldemort, can sometimes trace that resonance if they know what to look for. It's not easy, but it's possible. So the Fidelius charm isn't the impenetrable fortress Dumbledore makes it sound like. It's more like a fortress with a single door that can be opened by one specific key. And if your enemy knows who holds that key. I tried to discuss this with James, but he thinks I'm grasping at straws, looking for problems where none exist. Dumbledore knows more about protective magic than any of us, he said. If he says the Fidelius charm is our best option, then it is. But what if Dumbledore's definition of best doesn't match ours? What if he's not trying to keep us safe, but to control exactly when and how we're found? I can't prove any of this. I can't even voice it without sounding like I've lost my mind. But I'm starting to think that the Fidelius charm isn't protection at all, it's bait. The next entry was dated October 23rd, and Remus could see where Lily's handwriting had become more jagged, as if her hands had been shaking as she wrote. October 23rd, 1981. The argument today was the worst we've ever had. Not with James, with Dumbledore. I tried to suggest alternatives to Sirius as secret keeper, tried to explain my concerns about the vulnerabilities of the Fidelius charm, and Dumbledore's reaction was frightening. "You will choose Sirius Black," he said, and his voice carried the kind of authority that makes ancient magic tremble. "This decision is not yours to make, Lily. Harry's future depends on following the path that has been laid out, not the path you might prefer." Harry's future. always Harry's future. No, never Harry's safety or happiness or life. Just his future role in Dumbledore's grand design. "And if I refuse?" I asked. "If we choose Peter instead, or Remus, what then?" The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. Dumbledore didn't threaten us, didn't raise his voice, didn't even look particularly angry. But something in his eyes, some cold calculation, made it clear that refusing him wasn't really an option. "I hope it won't come to that, my dear," he said finally. "I would hate for Harry to lose his parents due to their poor judgment in addition to the war." It wasn't until after he left that I realized what he'd said. Not due to the war in addition to their poor judgment. As if our deaths were already factored into his plans, and the only question was whether they'd serve his purpose or not. "James is angry with me for challenging Dumbledore. He says I'm putting our family at risk by refusing to trust the only person who can protect us. But I don't think Dumbledore wants to protect us. I think he wants to position us exactly where we need to be for his prophecy to come true. I've made a decision. We'll agree to the Fidelius charm. We don't have a choice about that. But we won't choose Sirius as secret keeper. Not if I can help it." Remus's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in the silence of the inn room. Lily had planned to refuse Dumbledore's demand. She'd intended to choose someone else as secret keeper, to defy the man who'd been manipulating them for months. But who had they chosen instead? The next entry answered his question, and the revelation hit him like a physical blow. October 24th, 1981. Morning. We did it. Last night, James and I finally agreed on a plan that might protect us from both Voldemort and Dumbledore. When the Fidelius charm is cast today, our secret keeper won't be Sirius. It will be Peter. The switch was Sirius's idea, actually. He came to the house last night after Dumbledore's ultimatum, and I could see he was as uncomfortable with the situation as I was. "Something doesn't feel right," he admitted. "Dumbledore's never been this insistent about strategy before. Usually he gives us options, lets us choose the approach that feels best. This feels like he's trying to control the outcome." So we hatched a plan. Publicly, we'll let everyone believe that Sirius is our secret keeper. Dumbledore will be satisfied. The Order will think the obvious choice was made, and any Death Eaters trying to track down our protector will focus their efforts on the wrong person. But privately, secretly, Peter will hold the real secret. No one will suspect him. He's never been the type they'd expect us to trust with something so important. He's not the strongest fighter or the cleverest strategist, but he's loyal and he's overlooked. And sometimes that's exactly what you need. The plan isn't perfect. Peter will have to live with the knowledge that our lives are in his hands, and I can see how much that responsibility weighs on him. But it's better than walking into whatever trap Dumbledore has laid for us. James is relieved to have found a solution that doesn't require defying Dumbledore directly. Sirius is pleased to be helping protect us without actually bearing the burden of keeping us safe. And Peter seems honored that we trust him with something so important. I pray we're making the right choice. The diary slipped from Remus's numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Peter. They'd chosen Peter Pettigrew as their secret keeper, not Sirius. Peter, who everyone believed was weak and overlooked and harmless. Peter, who had been sitting in Order meetings for months, listening to Dumbledore's plans, watching the manipulation unfold. Peter, who had betrayed them. All this time, Remus had believed that Sirius had sold James and Lily to Voldemort. The entire wizarding world believed it. Sirius was probably in Azkaban right now, imprisoned for a crime he hadn't committed, while the real traitor had escaped justice entirely. But there was one more entry, dated later that same day, and Remus forced himself to pick up the diary and read Lily's final words. October 24th, 1981. Evening. The Fidelius charm has been cast. We are hidden now, protected by Peter's loyalty and Dumbledore's ignorance of our true arrangement. For the first time in months, I feel like we might actually be safe. But I can't shake the feeling that we're still walking into a trap. Not Dumbledore's trap. He doesn't know about the switch, so his plans for Sirius won't work. But what if there's another trap we haven't seen? What if someone else knows about Peter? I keep thinking about the way Peter looked when we asked him to be our secret keeper. Honored, yes, but also something else. Something I can't quite name. Maybe it was just the weight of responsibility, but for a moment he almost looked guilty. No, that's not fair. Peter has been nothing but loyal to us, to all of us since school. He's risked his life for the Order more times than I can count. If I can't trust him, then I can't trust anyone. But I've hidden this diary with extra protections now, charms that will preserve it, even if something happens to me. Because if the worst happens, if our enemies find us despite all our precautions, then someone needs to know the truth about what we tried to do. Someone needs to know that we died, trying to protect our son from the people who claim to be protecting him. I love James. I love Harry. I love the life we built together, however brief it might be. But most of all, I love the hope that someday, Harry will grow up free to choose his own destiny. That was the last entry. Below it, the pages were blank, waiting for words that would never come. Remus sat in the pale morning light, holding the diary that contained the truth about the last week of his friends' lives. They hadn't trusted Sirius with their secret. They'd trusted Peter. And Peter had betrayed them, had sold them to Voldemort for reasons Remus couldn't begin to understand. But worse than Peter's betrayal was the realization that it might have been exactly what Dumbledore had planned all along. Not Sirius's capture or conversion, but Peter's treachery, a betrayal that would seem to come from nowhere, that would destroy the Marauder's friendship and deliver Harry Potter directly into the hands of his supposed destiny. The war was over. Voldemort was gone. Sirius was imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. Peter was free, probably being celebrated as a hero for his supposed last stand against Sirius. And somewhere in the world, Harry Potter was living whatever life Dumbledore had arranged for him, being shaped into whatever weapon the old wizard needed him to become. Remus closed the diary and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of secrets that could change everything. Lily had died trying to protect Harry from his supposed protectors. She'd documented months of manipulation and control, had seen through Dumbledore's plans and tried to find another way. Now it was up to Remus to finish what she'd started, to find Harry, to learn what had really happened on Halloween night, and to make sure that Lily's sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The truth was more terrible than he'd imagined, but it was also more necessary than ever. Because if Dumbledore could manipulate the war itself to serve his purposes, if he could orchestrate the deaths of two of the most powerful wizards of their generation to fulfill a prophecy, then what else might he be planning? What other sacrifices had he deemed necessary for the greater good? Remus stood and walked to the window, watching the village wake up to another ordinary day. Somewhere out there, the truth about Halloween night was waiting to be uncovered. Somewhere out there, Harry Potter needed someone to stand between him and the man who'd already decided how his story would end. And for the first time since he'd learned of his friends' deaths, Remus knew exactly what he had to do. Chapter 5. Confronting the Truth. The journey to Hogwarts felt both endless and far too brief. Remus had apparated to Hogsmeade just as the November afternoon was fading into evening, and now he walked the familiar path to the castle with Lily's diary clutched against his chest like a talisman. Every step brought him closer to answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear, to a confrontation that would either vindicate his friend's memory or destroy everything he'd believed about the man he'd followed for years, The castle looked exactly as it always had, ancient stones glowing warm in the lamplight, windows flickering with the movement of students and teachers going about their evening routines. Normal, peaceful, as if the war that had raged outside these walls had been nothing more than a distant storm, finally past. It was almost obscene, this return to normalcy, when James and Lily lay dead, and their son was somewhere in the world, being shaped for whatever destiny Dumbledore had planned for him. The gargoyle guarding the entrance to the headmaster's office regarded Remus with stone eyes that seemed almost sympathetic. He gave the password, chocolate frogs, unchanged since his student days, and rode the spiral staircase upward, each revolution bringing him closer to answers he dreaded. Dumbledore was seated behind his desk when Remus entered, looking for all the world like a kindly grandfather, rather than the manipulative strategist Lily's diary had revealed him to be. Fawkes perched on his stand nearby, brilliant red and gold feathers catching the firelight, and the various magical instruments that lined the office hummed and clicked with their usual quiet industry. It was a scene of perfect, orchestrated calm, which only made Remus more certain that Dumbledore had been expecting him. "Remus," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying the gentle warmth that had once made Remus feel safe, protected, valued. "I wondered when you might come to see me. Please, sit down. I imagine you have questions about recent events." "Questions?" Remus remained standing, his hand tightening around the diary. "That's certainly one way to put it." Dumbledore's eyes, those blue eyes that had always seemed to see straight through to the heart of things, regarded him with something that might have been sadness or might have been calculation. "You're grieving, my dear boy. Or James and Lily were. Don't." The word came out sharper than Remus had intended, cutting through Dumbledore's platitudes like a blade. "Don't you dare talk about them as if they were simply casualties of war, as if their deaths were some unavoidable tragedy." For a moment, something flickered in Dumbledore's expression. Not surprise. He'd been expecting this. Remus was sure of it now. But perhaps disappointment that the confrontation had come so soon. "I see that you're upset. Perhaps we should postpone this conversation until I found her diary." Remus pulled the leather-bound journal from inside his robes and set it on Dumbledore's desk with deliberate care. Lily's diary. She documented everything, Albus. Every manipulation, every demand, or every time you pushed them closer to the trap you'd laid for them. Dumbledore stared at the diary for a long moment, and when he looked back up at Remus, his expression had shifted. Still calm, still controlled, but with an edge of wariness that hadn't been there before. "Grief can distort our perceptions, Remus. In times of great loss, we sometimes see conspiracies where there are only— Listen to this." Remus opened the diary to one of the later entries and began to read aloud, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet office. "Dumbledore was here again today, and I'm starting to dread the sound of his footsteps on our garden path. He wants James to take another mission, something involving Death Eater safe houses in Wales. Dangerous work, while the kind that requires someone who can think quickly under pressure." He looked up at Dumbledore. "She was 8 months pregnant when you sent James on that mission. 8 months. The war required difficult choices. But I'm 8 months pregnant," Remus continued reading. "And Dumbledore wants to send my husband into a situation where he might not come back." When I pointed this out, gently, diplomatically, the way we've all learned to speak to him, he just gave me that infuriating smile. "My dear Lily, the war will not pause for domestic concerns. James understands his duty." Remus closed the diary with a sharp snap. "Domestic concerns, that's what you called their child. An inconvenience to your grand strategy." Dumbledore was silent for several heartbeats, his fingers steepled before him. When he spoke, his voice carried less of the grandfatherly warmth and more of the steel that had made dark wizards fear him. Every war requires sacrifices, Remus. I made choices that seemed best for the greatest number. No. Remus leaned forward, bracing his hands on the desk. You made choices that served your vision of how the war should end. There's a difference. He opened the diary again, flipping to another entry. May 18th, 1981. I know what the prophecy says now. Not all of it. I only caught fragments, but enough to understand why Dumbledore has been watching Harry the way he does. She overheard you, Albus. Heard you and McGonagall discussing Harry's destiny, his purpose, the role he was meant to play. Dumbledore's eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. Prophecies are complex things, Remus, and the future is not set in stone. The boy must be prepared for what's coming, Remus read, his voice rising. There's no avoiding it. Every day Tom grows stronger, more desperate. Every day brings us closer to the moment when Harry Potter must fulfill his purpose. And when McGonagall asked what would happen if he didn't survive it, do you remember what you said? The office had gone very still. Even Fawkes seemed to be listening, his golden eyes fixed on his master, with something that might have been judgment. Then he will have died as a hero, Remus quoted, and the wizarding world will remember him as such. But I must believe, that there is a way for him to live through what must be done. I simply haven't found it yet. The silence that followed was deafening. Dumbledore sat motionless behind his desk, and for the first time since Remus had known him, the great Albus Dumbledore looked old. Not wise or powerful or mysteriously knowing, just old and tired and perhaps a little ashamed. Harry Potter was 15 months old when you said those words, Remus continued, his voice deadly quiet now. 15 months old, and you were already planning his martyrdom, already accepting his death as the price of defeating Voldemort. The prophecy, Dumbledore began. The prophecy said he had the power to vanquish the Dark Lord. It didn't say he had to die doing it. That was your interpretation, your choice. Remus straightened, looking down at the man he'd once trusted with his life. You convinced yourself that Harry's death was inevitable, and then you arranged events to make it so. You don't understand the forces at work here, or the ancient magic. I understand that you sent James and Lily to their deaths. Remus's voice was steady now, carved from ice and grief and rage. I understand that you manipulated them into choosing a secret keeper you could compromise. I understand that you've been planning to sacrifice their son since before he could walk. Dumbledore stood slowly, his hands flat on the desk between them. And what would you have had me do, Remus? Allow Tom to grow stronger, while we waited for a perfect solution that might never come? Let him tear apart the wizarding world while we protected one child's innocence? I would have had you find another way, the way Lily was trying to find. Remus picked up the diary, holding it between them like evidence in a trial. She saw through you, Albus. Months before she died, when she realized that you weren't protecting her family, you were positioning them exactly where you needed them to be for your prophecy to come true. Lily was a remarkable woman, Dumbledore said, and for a moment his voice carried genuine sorrow. Brilliant, compassionate, fiercely protective of her son. But she couldn't see the larger picture, the scope of what was at stake. The larger picture. Remus laughed, but there was no humor in it. That's what you called their lives? Their deaths? Harry's planned sacrifice? Variables in your equation for the greater good? Sometimes the needs of the many. No. Remus slammed his hand down on the desk, hard enough to rattle the magical instruments that lined it. Don't quote your philosophy at me. I've seen where it leads. Our James and Lily are dead because you decided their deaths served your purposes. Harry is somewhere in the world, being shaped for whatever role you've decided he should play next, and you're going to use the same justification when you send him to die. Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, his blue eyes studying Remus as if seeing him clearly for the first time. What do you want from me, Remus? Absolution? Justification? An apology for choices that had to be made? I want to know where Harry is. The request hung in the air between them, and Remus saw something shift in Dumbledore's expression. Not surprise, the old wizard was far too controlled for that, but a kind of resigned wariness, as if he'd been expecting this question and dreading it in equal measure. Harry is safe, Dumbledore said carefully. He's been placed with family, people who will protect him, the same way you protected his parents. Remus, I understand your anger, but Harry's location must remain confidential, for his own safety, and for the safety of those caring for him. His safety. Remus stared at the man who'd once been his mentor, his guide, the closest thing to a father he'd ever known. You mean his availability? You want to know exactly where he is when you need him next. I want him to grow up free from the burden of fame, free from those who would seek to use him for their own purposes. Like you're using him. Dumbledore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Everything I have done has been in service of protecting the wizarding world from darkness. Every choice, every sacrifice, every difficult decision has been made with that goal in mind. And if Harry dies in service of that goal, then he will have died a hero's death, and his sacrifice will not be forgotten. The admission hung between them like a blade. Dumbledore had said it simply, without drama or justification, as if Harry's eventual death were as natural and inevitable as sunrise, and perhaps, in the twisted logic of the greater good, it was. Remus closed the diary and tucked it back inside his robes. Then we have nothing more to discuss. Remus, wait. Dumbledore's voice carried a note of something that might have been desperation. I know this is difficult to understand, but there are larger forces at work here. Ancient magic, old debts, prophecies that bind us all to paths we might not choose but cannot avoid. Harry Potter has a destiny. Harry Potter has a life, Remus interrupted. Or he did, until you decided it belonged to your cause instead of to him. He turned and walked toward the door, but Dumbledore's voice followed him. Where will you go, Remus? What will you do? You cannot simply walk away from this. Remus paused at the threshold, his hand on the door handle. Watch me. If you interfere with Harry's protection, if you disrupt the careful arrangements that have been made, you mean if I try to save him from the fate you've planned for him? Remus looked back over his shoulder. If I try to give him the choice his parents died trying to protect? You don't understand the consequences. I understand them perfectly. Remus opened the door, and the cool air of the corridor beyond felt like freedom after the suffocating atmosphere of the office. James and Lily trusted you, and you sent them to their deaths. They asked you to protect their son, and you turned him into a weapon. They believed in your cause, and you used that belief to destroy them. He stepped into the corridor, then turned back one last time. But I won't make the same mistake they did. I won't trust you with Harry's life. The last thing he saw before closing the door was Dumbledore's face, and for just a moment, beneath the careful control and political calculation, there was something that looked almost like regret. But it was too little, and far too late. Remus walked through the castle corridors with steady steps, and past the portraits that whispered among themselves, and the ghosts that drifted through walls with curious glances. Students hurried past him on their way to dinner or evening activities, their faces bright with the careless happiness of youth. None of them knew that their world had been shaped by a man willing to sacrifice anyone, including children, for his vision of the greater good. But Remus knew now, and knowing, he could no longer stand aside and watch it happen. The war was over, but the fight for Harry Potter's soul was just beginning. And this time, Remus intended to be on the right side from the start. Chapter 6. Allies in the Shadows. The Three Broomsticks was quieter than Remus remembered from his student days. The war's end had brought a cautious peace to Hogsmeade. but not the celebratory atmosphere he might have expected. People spoke in lower voices, glanced over their shoulders more often, as if they couldn't quite believe that the darkness was truly gone. Or perhaps, like Remus himself, they were beginning to understand that the darkness had never been as simple as one Dark Lord and his followers. He sat in a corner booth, nursing a butterbeer he hadn't touched, and watching the entrance for a familiar figure. It had taken him most of the morning to track down Minerva McGonagall's schedule and send a carefully worded message requesting a private meeting. He'd been deliberately vague about the purpose. After his confrontation with Dumbledore yesterday, he couldn't be certain who could be trusted with the full truth. When McGonagall finally arrived, she looked older than he remembered. The war had aged all of them, but there was something different in her bearing now, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. She spotted him immediately and made her way to his table with the brisk efficiency that had always characterized her movements. "Remus," she said, settling into the seat across from him. "Your message was cryptic. I trust this isn't simply a social call?" "Not exactly." Remus studied her face, looking for signs of the woman Lily had described in her diary, the one who had questioned Dumbledore's plans, who had expressed doubts about Harry's destiny. "I wanted to ask you about the Potter family, about the decisions that were made regarding their protection." Something shifted in McGonagall's expression, what a tightening around her eyes that suggested he'd touched on a subject she'd been trying not to think about. "That's a painful topic, Remus. James and Lily they were murdered because someone made choices that served the war effort more than their safety." Remus leaned forward, keeping his voice low. "I found Lily's diary, Minerva. I know about the conversations you had with Dumbledore about Harry's destiny." The colour drained from McGonagall's face so quickly that Remus thought she might faint. She gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "You found what?" "Lily documented everything. Months of pressure from Dumbledore, demands that made no sense unless you understood his true goals. She overheard you and Dumbledore discussing Harry's role in the prophecy." Remus pulled the diary from his robes, but didn't open it, simply let it rest on the table between them. "She heard you ask if there was another interpretation, another way. She heard Dumbledore say that Harry would die as a hero, if necessary." McGonagall stared at the diary as if it were a snake, coiled to strike. "Dear God," she whispered. "She heard all of that?" "You remember the conversation, then?" "I remember arguing with Albus about the wisdom of planning a child's death before that child could even speak." McGonagall's voice carried a bitterness that Remus had never heard from her before. "I remember being told that my concerns were noted, but irrelevant to the larger strategy. I remember walking away from that conversation, feeling sick to my stomach." "But you didn't speak out publicly. You didn't challenge him." McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded on the table. When she looked up, her eyes were filled with something that might have been shame. "What was I supposed to do, Remus? Question the judgment of the greatest wizard of our age in the middle of a war? Demand that he abandon his plans based on my squeamishness about necessary sacrifices? You could have warned James and Lily. With what? Suspicions? Fears? They trusted Dumbledore completely. You know they did. If I had gone to them with doubts about his methods, they would have dismissed me as a worried old woman who couldn't see the bigger picture." Remus opened the diary to one of Lily's entries about McGonagall's visit, the one where she'd let slip information about the prophecy's timing. She was already questioning his methods. If you had spoken up, if you had shared your doubts, she might have felt less alone in her concerns. McGonagall read the entry he showed her, and her face crumpled slightly. "She was investigating prophecies because of what I told her. Oh, Lily. She died trying to protect Harry from Dumbledore's plans, and now Harry is somewhere out there, being shaped for whatever role Dumbledore has decided he should play next." Remus closed the diary and leaned back in his chair. The question is, are you going to help me stop it this time? Or are you going to stand aside again and hope someone else makes the difficult choices? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sounds of other conversations and the crackling of the pub's fire. McGonagall sat very still, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, and Remus could see the war playing out behind her eyes, duty against conscience, loyalty against truth. Finally, she spoke. "What do you need from me?" "Information. Names of other Order members who might have had similar doubts. Help finding allies who care more about Harry's welfare than about fulfilling prophecies." McGonagall nodded slowly. "Kingsley Shacklebolt. He's been asking uncomfortable questions about ministry protocols regarding the Potter family's protection, or apparently there were several offers of safe houses and protective details that were declined on their behalf." Declined by whom? By someone with the authority to speak for them. Someone who convinced the ministry that their current arrangements were sufficient. McGonagall's voice was carefully neutral, but the implication was clear. Anyone else? Mad-Eye has been drinking more than usual since the war ended. When he drinks, he talks. And when he talks... McGonagall hesitated. He's been asking questions about the intelligence that led to the Potters being discovered. Questions about timing, about how Voldemort knew exactly when and where to find them. Remus felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. He wasn't alone in his suspicions. Other members of the Order had noticed the inconsistencies, the convenient timing, the decisions that seemed to serve Dumbledore's strategy more than the people they were supposed to protect. "There's someone else you should speak with," McGonagall continued. "Arabella Figg. She's the squib who lives near..." She paused, seeming to reconsider her words. "She's been given very specific instructions about monitoring certain situations. Instructions that might interest you. Where can I find her?" "Little Whinging, Surrey. Number 2, Wisteria Walk." McGonagall stood, then paused. "Remus, what you're contemplating. Going against Dumbledore, questioning his judgment. It won't be easy. He has resources, influence, connections that reach into every corner of the wizarding world." "And Harry has me," Remus said quietly. "It'll have to be enough." 3 hours later, Remus stood on the doorstep of a small, neat house in Little Whinging, surrounded by the kind of suburban normalcy that made his skin crawl. He could feel the magic humming around this place, protective charms layered so thickly that they were almost visible to his enhanced senses. Whatever, or whoever, was being protected here, Dumbledore had spared no effort in making sure they stayed that way. Arabella Figg answered the door on his second knock, her grey hair pulled back severely and her eyes sharp with suspicion. She was older than Remus had expected, with the kind of weathered face that suggested a life spent watching and waiting and keeping secrets. "You're Lupin," she said without preamble. "Minerva said you might come by." "Miss Figg, I hope I'm not intruding." "You are, but that's nothing new in this business." She stepped back and gestured for him to enter. "No tea?" The inside of her house was as neat and ordinary as the outside, with the exception of the dozens of cats that seemed to occupy every available surface. They watched Remus with the kind of intelligent attention that suggested they were more than simple pets. "Nasal crosses," Arabella explained, noticing his interest. "Excellent for surveillance work. They see things normal cats miss, and they're loyal as long as you keep them fed." She led him to a small sitting room and busied herself with preparing tea, while Remus tried to process the implications of her casual revelation about surveillance. When she finally sat down across from him, her expression was carefully neutral. "Minerva said you had questions about my instructions regarding the Potter boy. Harry's being monitored. Harry's being watched, protected, and reported on at regular intervals. Has been since the night he was placed with his relatives." Arabella sipped her tea, studying Remus over the rim of her cup. "The question is whether you're here as Dumbledore's agent or as something else, entirely." "I'm here because I think Harry's in danger. Not from Death Eaters or dark wizards, but from the people who claim to be protecting him. Something flickered in Arabella's eyes. Relief, perhaps, or recognition. And what makes you think that? Remus pulled out Lily's diary once again, finding it easier each time to use her words as evidence against the man they'd all trusted. He read her entries about Dumbledore's obsession with Harry's role in the war, about the prophecy that demanded a child's sacrifice, about the manipulation that had led to her family's destruction. When he finished, Arabella was quiet for a long time. One of her cats had jumped onto her lap and was purring softly as she stroked its fur, but her eyes never left Remus's face. "How much do you know about the family Harry's been placed with?" she asked finally. "Only that they're relatives. Lily's sister and her family. They hate magic, hate it with the kind of passionate loathing that turns love into poison." Arabella's voice was carefully controlled, but Remus could hear the anger underneath. "They view Harry as an unwelcome burden at best, an active threat to their normal life at worst, and my instructions are to watch and report, but never to intervene, no matter what I observe." The implication hit Remus like a physical blow. He's being mistreated. He's 15 months old, and he's being raised by people who see him as a constant reminder of everything they fear and despise. Draw your own conclusions. And Dumbledore knows this. Dumbledore arranged it. Arabella set down her teacup with deliberate care. He chose this placement specifically, despite having other options available. When I asked why, I was told that Harry needed to grow up away from the magical world, free from the corrupting influence of fame and adulation. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is that a child who grows up unloved, unwanted, and aware of his difference from the people around him is a child who will be grateful for any adult who offers him purpose and belonging, even if that purpose requires him to sacrifice his life for the greater good. The tea turned to acid in Remus's mouth. Where Harry wasn't being protected, he was being conditioned, shaped into the perfect weapon, one who would willingly embrace martyrdom because it would finally give his life meaning. "There's more," Arabella continued. "I've been instructed to compile detailed reports about Harry's development, his magical incidents, his relationship with his guardians. Those reports go directly to Dumbledore, and they're not shared with anyone else in the Order. You're documenting his abuse. I'm documenting his preparation. Every moment of neglect, every instance of emotional cruelty, every time he's made to feel different or unwanted, it's all being carefully recorded and analyzed." Arabella stood and walked to the window, looking out at the ordinary street where extraordinary manipulation was taking place. By the time Harry receives his Hogwarts letter, Dumbledore will have a complete psychological profile detailing exactly how to motivate him, how to earn his loyalty, how to convince him that dying for the wizarding world is not just necessary but heroic. Remus felt sick. The scope of Dumbledore's planning was breathtaking in its cold calculation. Harry wasn't just a weapon. He was a weapon that had been custom-designed from infancy to serve Dumbledore's purposes. "Will you help us stop it?" he asked. "Us?" "McGonagall is willing to act. There are others. Kingsley Shacklebolt, possibly Mad-Eye Moody. People who've seen enough to have questions." Arabella turned back to him, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. "Mr. Lupin, I've been watching a toddler be systematically broken down by people who should love him, all in service of a plan that will eventually require his death. Of course I'll help you stop it." By evening, Remus found himself in a different pub, the Leaky Cauldron in London, sitting across from Kingsley Shacklebolt and Mad-Eye Moody. The two auras made an unlikely pair, Kingsley calm and diplomatic, Mad-Eye paranoid and scarred, but both radiating the kind of competence that came from years of hunting dark wizards. "You're talking about treason," Mad-Eye said bluntly, after Remus had finished explaining what he'd discovered. "Going against Dumbledore, interfering with his plans, that's not just insubordination, That's betraying the entire war effort. The war's over, Remus pointed out. The war against Voldemort is over, Mad-Eye corrected. The war for the soul of the wizarding world might just be beginning. Kingsley leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. The ministry protocols you mentioned, Remus. I've been reviewing those files since our conversation yesterday. There were indeed multiple offers of protection for the Potter family that were declined on their behalf. Safe houses, aura details, even a suggestion that they be relocated to a different country entirely. All declined by Dumbledore? All declined by someone with authority to speak for them. Someone who convinced the ministry that their current security arrangements were adequate. Kingsley paused. But here's what's interesting. The final report recommending against additional protection was filed the day before they were killed. Mad-Eye's magical eye spun wildly for a moment, before fixing on Remus. That's not coincidence. That's timing so precise it had to be planned. You think Dumbledore knew when the attack would happen? I think Dumbledore arranged for the attack to happen when it did, Mad-Eye said grimly. The intelligence that led Voldemort to Godric's Hollow had to come from somewhere, and the only people who knew the Potter's location were people Dumbledore trusted. Peter Pettigrew, Remus said quietly. He was their secret keeper, and he betrayed them. Or he was convinced to betray them, Kingsley suggested. Pettigrew never struck me as the type to turn traitor for ideological reasons, but fear, blackmail, the threats against people he cared about, those might have been enough. Either way, Mad-Eye said, the result was exactly what Dumbledore needed. The Potters dead, Harry orphaned, and available for placement wherever Dumbledore saw fit, and the prophecy advanced another step toward fulfillment. The three men sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the implications of what they were discussing. Around them, the pub hummed with conversation and laughter. Ordinary witches and wizards, celebrating the end of the war and the beginning of a new era of peace. None of them knew that the real war, the one for a child's soul, was just beginning. So what do you want from us? Kingsley asked finally. Help finding Harry and getting him away from the people who are systematically destroying him, and help building a network of people who care more about his welfare than about fulfilling ancient prophecies. Remus looked at each of them in turn. Help giving him the choice his parents died trying to protect. Mad-Eye drained his whiskey and set the glass down with a sharp click. I've been an aura for 30 years. I've hunted dark wizards, fought in wars, seen more evil than most people can imagine. But using a child as a weapon, conditioning him from infancy to accept his own death, that's a level of manipulation that makes me sick. Count me in, Kingsley said simply. Mad-Eye nodded his agreement. Constant vigilance, he said, but his voice carried a different meaning now. Not watching for external threats, but watching the watchers themselves. As they stood to leave, Remus felt something he hadn't experienced since reading Lily's diary. Hope. He wasn't alone in this. There were others who had seen through Dumbledore's manipulations, others who were willing to act to protect Harry from the destiny that had been chosen for him. The war for Harry Potter's life was about to begin in earnest, and this time Remus intended to be on the side of the child, not the cause. Chapter 7. The Hunt for Harry Potter. The safe house Kingsley had arranged was a cramped flat above a Muggle bookshop in London, warded so thoroughly that even approaching the building required a specific sequence of turns through nearby alleys. It wasn't much to look at. Peeling wallpaper, mismatched furniture, and windows that hadn't been cleaned in years. But it had the one quality that mattered most. It was completely invisible to anyone who might be looking for them on Dumbledore's behalf. Remus spread a detailed map of Surrey across the kitchen table, weighing down the corners with empty teacups and marking locations with different-coloured pins. 3 days of careful investigation had narrowed their search considerably, but they still needed to pinpoint Harry's exact location before they could attempt any kind of rescue. Little whinging, McGonagall said, pointing to a cluster of suburban streets on the map. Arabella was certain of the town, but she couldn't give us more than that without arousing suspicion. Couldn't or wouldn't, Mad Eye growled from his position by the window, a magical eye spinning as he maintained constant surveillance of the street below. That woman's been playing both sides since before any of us knew there were sides to play. She's risking everything by helping us, Remus reminded him. If Dumbledore discovers her involvement, he'll do what exactly? Find another squib willing to document child abuse for the greater good? Mad Eye's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. She's not as replaceable as she thinks, and she knows it. Kingsley looked up from the stack of ministry files he'd been reviewing, his expression troubled. I've been going through housing records for little whinging, cross-referencing with magical signatures detected in Muggle areas. But there's definitely something happening on Privet Drive. The monitoring charms are so thick they're practically visible. How many houses? McGonagall asked. The entire street shows elevated magical activity, but it's concentrated around numbers 2 through 6. If I had to guess, I'd say the actual target is number 4, with protective monitoring extending to the neighboring houses. Remus felt a familiar chill settle in his stomach. Number 4. Privet Drive. Somewhere behind that mundane address, Harry Potter was living with relatives who saw him as a burden at best, actively hostile at worst, and every day he spent there was another day of conditioning, another step in Dumbledore's plan to shape him into the perfect sacrifice. We need someone who was actually involved in placing Harry there, he said. Someone who knows the exact details of Dumbledore's arrangements. That would be Hagrid, McGonagall said quietly. He's the one who retrieved Harry from the ruins and delivered him to Privet Drive on Dumbledore's orders. Will he talk to us? Hagrid's loyalty to Dumbledore runs deeper than anyone's, she admitted. But his love for children runs deeper still. If we can make him understand what's really happening to Harry. An hour later, Remus found himself walking through the grounds of Hogwarts under a disillusionment charm, making his way toward Hagrid's hut with the careful steps of someone who knew he was probably being watched. The gamekeeper's cottage looked exactly as it always had, smoke rising from the chimney, vegetables growing in neat rows despite the November chill, Tofang's massive form visible through one of the windows. He knocked softly and waited, listening to the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the door. When it opened, Hagrid's beetle-black eyes widened with surprise, and something that might have been relief. Remus, blimey, I was wondering when you'd turn up. Hagrid stepped back to let him enter, glancing around the grounds before closing the door. Heard you had words with Dumbledore t'other day. Whole castle's been whispering about it. Word travels fast. Aye, well, when someone walks out of the headmaster's office looking like they've seen a ghost, people take notice. Hagrid busied himself with putting the kettle on, but his movements were jerky, nervous. You want to tell me what that was about? Remus settled into one of Hagrid's enormous chairs and studied his old friend's face. Hagrid had always worn his emotions openly, and right now he looked like a man carrying secrets that were eating him alive. It was about Harry Potter, Remus said quietly. About what Dumbledore has planned for him. The tea tin slipped from Hagrid's hands and clattered to the floor, spilling leaves across the stone flags. Harry's fine, he said quickly, too quickly. Safe as houses with his family. Dumbledore made sure of it. What family, Hagrid? Where did you take him? I can't. Hagrid stopped himself, looking miserable. Dumbledore said it was secret. Said Harry's safety depended on nobody knowing where he was. Remus pulled Lily's diary from his robes and set it on the table between them. Or Lily documented everything, Hagrid. Dumbledore's manipulation, his plans for Harry, the way he's been positioning pieces on a board for months. Harry isn't safe. He's being prepared. Prepared for what? To die for the cause when the time comes. To sacrifice himself willingly because he's been conditioned from infancy to believe that's what heroes do. Hagrid sank into his chair as if his legs would no longer support him. That's not... Dumbledore wouldn't... Read it yourself, Remus opened the diary to one of the entries about the prophecy, about Dumbledore's casual acceptance of Harry's eventual death. This is in Lily's own handwriting, her observations, her fears, her growing realization that the man they trusted was planning to destroy her family. Hagrid read slowly, his lips moving slightly as he worked through Lily's elegant script. With each line, his face grew paler, his expression more stricken. When he finished, he looked up at Remus with eyes that held a pain deeper than grief. "He made me take Harry to his aunt and uncle," he whispered. 4 Privet Drive, Little Whinging. Said they were his only family. Said they'd love him like their own. His voice cracked. But when I handed him over, when I saw how they looked at him, like he was something dirty, something dangerous. You had doubts. I had more than doubts. I asked Dumbledore if we shouldn't reconsider, find someone else to take him. Someone who'd actually want him. Hagrid wiped his eyes with the back of his massive hand. But he said it had to be blood relatives, and said the protection would only work with family. What protection? Blood wards, he called them. Magic that would keep Harry safe as long as he called his aunt's house home. But the way he said it... Hagrid frowned, as if trying to remember something that had bothered him at the time. It wasn't safe like protected. It was safe like contained. Remus felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Blood wards that required Harry to stay with relatives who despised him. Protection magic that functioned more like a prison, keeping him in one place where Dumbledore could monitor his development. And all of it justified by the need to keep him safe until he was old enough to fulfill his destiny. Hagrid, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that night. The house, the family, the protections Dumbledore put in place. Told everything. For the next hour, Hagrid described the events of November 1st in painful detail. The flight to Little Whinging on his borrowed motorcycle, baby Harry sleeping in his arms, the moment when he'd handed the most famous child in the wizarding world to relatives who looked at him like he was a bomb waiting to explode. The Dursleys, Hagrid said, the name bitter on his tongue. Vernon's a great bullying walrus of a man, hates anything that's not perfectly normal. Petunia's Lily's sister. But you'd never know it. Cold as winter, she is. And proud of it. And they've got a son about Harry's age, spoiled rotten from what I could see. What about the house itself? Ordinary muggle dwelling, all beige and boring. But I could feel the magic Dumbledore had layered around it. Monitoring charms, containment spells, the protections that felt more like shackles than shields. Hagrid's eyes met Remus's. If you're thinking of doing something about this, you should know that place is watched, not just by magic. There's someone keeping an eye on things from nearby. Arabella Figg. Aye, that's her. Lives a few streets over. Reports back to Dumbledore regular-like. She'll know if anyone tries to approach that house. Remus nodded, filing away the information. They'd have to account for Arabella in their planning, find a way to neutralize her surveillance without alerting Dumbledore to their intentions. Will you help us, Hagrid? Help us get Harry away from that place before it destroys him completely? Hagrid was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire as if seeking answers in the flames. When he spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation and determination in equal measure. I carried that boy out of the wreckage of his parents' home. Felt his little hand grip my finger while he slept. Trust in me to keep him safe. He looked up at Remus, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears. If I failed him then by delivering him to people who'd hurt him, then I won't fail him again by standing aside while they finish the job. Back at the safe house, the others listened in grim silence as Remus relayed what he'd learned from Hagrid. The picture that emerged was worse than any of them had imagined. Harry trapped with relatives who despised him, surrounded by monitoring magic that served more to contain than protect, being shaped from infancy into the perfect weapon for Dumbledore's cause. 4 Privet Drive, Kingsley said, marking the location on their map with a red pin. That matches the magical signatures I've been tracking. The whole area's saturated with monitoring charms. Can we get past them? Remus asked. Getting past them isn't the problem. I could disable most of those protections in my sleep. The problem is doing it without triggering alarms that will bring Dumbledore running. Kingsley studied the map, tracing possible approach routes with his finger. We'd need a distraction, something to draw his attention elsewhere, while we extract Harry. What about Arabella Figg? McGonagall asked. She's supposed to be watching the house. How do we account for her? Carefully, Mad-Eye said. Woman's been playing both sides, feeding information to Dumbledore while helping us. Could be she's genuinely conflicted. Or could be she's setting us up for a trap. Remus considered this. Arabella had seemed sincere in her horror at Harry's treatment, her willingness to help in his rescue. But Mad-Eye was right. In their current situation, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. We approach her directly, he decided. Tell her we're moving forward with or without her cooperation, but give her the chance to help us do it right. If she's genuinely on our side, she'll want to minimize the risks to Harry. If she's setting us up? If she's setting us up, we'll know soon enough, Mad-Eye finished grimly. And we'll deal with it accordingly. They spent the rest of the evening planning their approach, mapping out surveillance routes and escape plans, discussing contingencies for everything from unexpected resistance to Dumbledore's early return. It was delicate work, requiring them to balance speed with stealth, boldness with caution. But beneath all the tactical planning, Remus felt something he hadn't experienced since reading Lily's diary. Hope. They were no longer simply uncovering the truth about Dumbledore's manipulation. They were actively working to prevent it, to save Harry from the destiny that had been chosen for him before he could even speak. "When do we move?" McGonagall asked, as they gathered their materials and prepared to return to their separate hiding places. Remus looked around at the faces of his allies, the professor who'd found her conscience too late, but was determined to act on it now, the auras who'd sworn to protect people and meant to honor that oath regardless of politics, at the gamekeeper who'd carried Harry to safety once and was ready to do it again. "Tomorrow night," he said. "We've waited long enough. It's time to give Harry Potter the choice his parents died trying to protect." Outside, London hummed with its usual energy, ordinary people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that the fate of the most famous child in the wizarding world was being decided in a cramped flat above a bookshop. But for Remus and his allies, tomorrow night couldn't come soon enough. They had a rescue to plan, a child to save, and a destiny to derail. And for the first time since this all began, Remus believed they might actually succeed. Chapter 8. The Dursley Revelation. The November rain drummed against the windows of the rented car as Remus sat in the driver's seat, yet watching the pristine suburban landscape of Little Whinging through a pair of omnioculars. Every house on Privet Drive looked identical. Neat lawns, tidy gardens, cars parked in driveways with military precision. It was the kind of neighborhood where deviation from the norm was treated as a personal failing, where difference was not just unwelcome, but actively suppressed. Perfect, in other words, for what Dumbledore had planned. "Movement in number 4, Kingsley murmured from the passenger seat, adjusting his own viewing equipment. "Large man. Looks like he's heading to work." Through the enhanced lenses, Remus watched Vernon Dursley emerge from his house, a walrus of a man, exactly as Hagrid had described him. He wore a suit that strained against his considerable bulk and carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone who viewed the world as an obstacle to his personal comfort. Behind him, visible through the front window, a thin woman with a neck like a giraffe was moving about the kitchen. "Petunia," Remus said quietly. Lily's sister. The woman who should have loved Harry like her own, but instead— "There," Kingsley said sharply. "Second floor window, far right." Remus adjusted his focus and felt his heart stop. In a small window that looked more like an afterthought than a proper room, He could see the shadow of what appeared to be a crib, and standing in that crib, gripping the bars with tiny hands, was a small figure with unmistakably messy, dark hair. Harry. Even from this distance, but even through the rain and the magical enhancement, Remus could see that something was wrong. The child was too small, too thin for 15 months. His movements were listless, lacking the energetic curiosity that should characterize a toddler his age, and the room itself, what Remus could see of it, looked more like a storage closet than a nursery. "That's not right," Kingsley said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "That's not how you house a child." Before Remus could respond, a car door slammed behind them. McGonagall slid into the back seat, her hair damp from the rain and her expression grim. She'd been meeting with Arabella Figg, gathering the detailed intelligence they needed for tonight's operation. "Well?" Remus asked, without taking his eyes off the house. "It's worse than we thought." McGonagall's voice was barely controlled. "Arabella has been documenting systematic neglect and emotional abuse since the day Harry was placed there. The room we can see, it's not a nursery. It's a converted storage space, barely large enough for a crib and a small dresser. His living conditions? Minimal food, irregular feeding schedule, no toys except what Arabella has secretly provided, and those are often taken away as punishment for crying or showing any signs of magic." McGonagall pulled out a thick folder. "These are copies of the reports she's been sending to Dumbledore. Monthly summaries of Harry's development that read more like torture documentation than childcare records." Remus finally lowered his omnioculars and turned to look at her. "Dumbledore knows all of this." "He knows, and he's ordered it to continue. According to Arabella, she's tried multiple times to report concerning incidents, times when Harry went without proper meals, when he was left crying for hours without attention, when his magical incidents triggered violent reactions from Vernon. Each time, she was told that these experiences were necessary for his development and that intervention would compromise his protection. Kingsley took the folder and began reading through the reports, his expression growing darker with each page. "This isn't neglect," he said finally. "This is deliberate conditioning. They're systematically breaking down a child's sense of worth and belonging." "Read the one from last month," McGonagall said quietly. Kingsley found the report and read aloud. "Subject continues to display above-average magical sensitivity, or with incidents occurring during periods of emotional distress. The Dursley family's negative response to these incidents appears to be having the desired effect. Subject is beginning to associate his magical abilities with punishment and rejection. Recommend continued monitoring without intervention to ensure optimal psychological conditioning proceeds as planned." The silence in the car was deafening. Outside, Privet Drive continued its peaceful suburban routine, neat houses hiding their secrets behind curtained windows and perfect lawns. "Optimal psychological conditioning," Remus repeated, his voice hollow. "They're torturing a 15-month-old baby, and Dumbledore is calling it optimal." "There's more," McGonagall said. She pulled out another document, this one covered in Dumbledore's own handwriting. Arabella found this in her most recent instructions. It's Dumbledore's analysis of the Blood Ward magic and its requirements. Remus took the document and read, his horror growing with each line. "The blood protection established through Lily Potter's sacrifice will remain active only as long as the child maintains residence with his mother's blood relatives. However, the strength of this protection is directly correlated with the child's emotional isolation and dependence. A child who feels loved and secure in his placement will gradually weaken the protective bonds, as contentment diminishes the magical resonance of his mother's sacrifice. Therefore, it is essential that Harry Potter's placement with the Dursleys remain emotionally challenging. His sense of displacement, his awareness of being unwanted, his growing hunger for acceptance and belonging, all of these factors serve to maintain and strengthen the blood wards." The child's suffering is not merely an unfortunate side effect of his protection. It is the very mechanism by which that protection functions. Regular monitoring will ensure that the Dursleys maintain appropriate emotional distance while providing basic physical care. Any signs of genuine affection or acceptance must be reported immediately, as these would compromise the magical protections and potentially expose the child to enemy detection. In essence, Harry Potter must be unloved in order to remain protected. This is an unfortunate but necessary sacrifice in service of the greater good. The paper crumpled in Remus's grip as his hands began to shake. But the Blood Wards didn't just require Harry to live with the Dursleys, they required him to be miserable there. His suffering wasn't a byproduct of his protection, it was the fuel that powered it. "He designed this," Remus whispered. "From the very beginning, Dumbledore planned for Harry to be systematically abused, not despite his protection, but because of it." "It gets worse," McGonagall said, though her voice suggested she wasn't sure how that was possible. "According to these reports, Harry's magical incidents are increasing in frequency and intensity. Yesterday, he turned his hair completely black while crying in his crib. Last week, he made his bottle refill itself when the Dursleys forgot to feed him lunch." "Natural magical development for a child his age," Kingsley said. "Accidental magic triggered by strong emotions are usually fear or distress. Except the Dursleys have been instructed to respond to these incidents with increased restriction and isolation. They're conditioning him to suppress his magical nature through fear and punishment." McGonagall's voice cracked slightly. "Dumbledore wants Harry to grow up believing his magic is something shameful, something that brings pain to himself and others." Through the rain-streaked windshield, Remus could see movement in the house again. Petunia Dursley appeared at the front window, holding what was clearly her own son, a chubby, well-dressed toddler about Harry's age, who was laughing and reaching for something outside. The contrast was devastating. Dudley Dursley, loved and cherished and encouraged, while Harry remained confined to his converted storage room, alone and unwanted. "Or the Blood Wards," Remus said suddenly. "If they require Harry's misery to function, what happens if we remove him? What happens to his protection?" "According to this," McGonagall said, indicating another section of Dumbledore's notes, "the protection would gradually fade over the course of several months, but Dumbledore believes that's acceptable, because by then Harry will have been shaped into the perfect weapon, desperate for approval, willing to sacrifice himself for anyone who shows him genuine affection, convinced that his magic is a burden he inflicts on others. In other words," Kingsley said grimly, "a child so damaged and desperate for love that he'll walk willingly to his death if someone he trusts asks him to." Remus stared at the house where his best friend's son was being systematically destroyed, and felt something cold and implacable settle in his chest. This wasn't just manipulation anymore. This was the deliberate psychological torture of a child, all in service of creating the perfect martyr for Dumbledore's cause. "We extract him tonight," he said. "The Blood Wards will fade, yes, but Harry will be alive and unbroken when they do." Remus started the car, no longer able to sit still while knowing what was happening behind those neat suburban walls. "We'll find other ways to protect him, ways that don't require him to suffer." "Dumbledore will come after us," McGonagall warned. "When he discovers we've disrupted his carefully laid plans, let him come." Remus's voice was steady, carved from ice and rage and determination. "I've seen enough. I've read enough. I've watched enough. Whatever else happens, Harry Potter will not spend another night in that house." They drove back to their safe house, in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd discovered. The rain continued to fall, washing the streets of Little Whinging clean while doing nothing to cleanse the horror of what was happening behind its perfect facades. Back at the flat above the bookshop, Mad-Eye and Hagrid were waiting with grim expressions and tactical equipment spread across the kitchen table. One look at the faces of the returning team members was enough to tell them that the surveillance had revealed exactly what they'd feared. How bad? Mad-Eye asked, without preamble. Systematic psychological torture, designed to create the perfect sacrificial lamb, Remus said, dropping Dumbledore's notes on the table. Could read it yourself. Mad-Eye's scarred face grew even more terrible as he worked through the documentation. Hagrid read over his shoulder, his massive hands clenched into fists that could have crushed stone. This is what I delivered him to, Hagrid whispered. This is what I helped create. You didn't know, McGonagall said firmly. None of us knew the full scope of what Dumbledore was planning. But we suspected, Mad-Eye said. All of us at one point or another, we suspected that something wasn't right, and we told ourselves that Dumbledore knew best, that he could see things we couldn't. His magical eye fixed on each of them in turn. Never again. Whatever else happens, we don't stand aside while children are sacrificed for anyone's vision of the greater good. What's our approach? Kingsley asked, studying the tactical plans they'd prepared. Simple and direct, Mad-Eye said. Hagrid creates a distraction on the far side of the neighborhood, something flashy but harmless that will draw attention away from Privet Drive. McGonagall and Kingsley handle the magical protections around the house. Remus goes in and gets the boy. And Arabella? Arabella has already done her part. She's going to report a family emergency that requires her immediate attention elsewhere, removing herself from surveillance duty for the evening. By the time Dumbledore realizes what's happened, we'll be long gone. Remus looked around at the faces of his allies, people who had chosen to risk everything to save a child they barely knew from a fate worse than death. Are we all certain about this? Once we take Harry, there's no going back, or Dumbledore will use every resource at his disposal to find us. Good, Hagrid rumbled. I've got 15 months' worth of guilt to work off. Let him try. He'll paint us as kidnappers, as criminals who've stolen the boy who lived for our own purposes, McGonagall warned. History will judge whether we're criminals or heroes, Kingsley said. But Harry Potter will be alive to see that judgment, and that's what matters. Mad-Eye stood and began distributing the equipment they'd assembled, modified portkeys for emergency escape, communication mirrors for coordination, detection charms to identify magical surveillance. We move at midnight. The Dursleys will be asleep, the neighborhood will be quiet, and we'll have maximum darkness to cover our approach. What about after? McGonagall asked. Where do we take him? Somewhere safe, Remus said. Somewhere Dumbledore can't reach him, can't manipulate him, can't turn him into a weapon. He thought of Lily's diary, of her final entries about wanting Harry to grow up free to choose his own destiny. Somewhere he can be a child instead of a symbol. As the evening wore on and their final preparations took shape, Remus found himself thinking about the moment when he'd first held baby Harry, just days after his birth. James had been so proud, so hopeful about the future they were building for their son. Lily had been radiant with love and fierce protectiveness, already making plans for Harry's education, his happiness, his place in a world where love would matter more than prophecies. They had died, trying to give their son a choice. Tonight, finally, that Remus would finish what they started. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the world clean for whatever came next. Chapter 9. Breaking the Chains. Midnight came to Privet Drive like a held breath. The suburban street lay wrapped in the kind of artificial quiet that only existed in places where conformity was valued above all else. Every house dark, every garden perfectly manicured, every deviation from normal hidden safely behind drawn curtains. It was the perfect stage for what was about to unfold. Remus crouched behind a hedge 3 houses down from number 4, his enhanced hearing picking up the subtle sounds of his team moving into position. Through his earpiece, he could hear Mad-Eye's gruff whisper, "Perimeter secure. Or no additional surveillance detected beyond what we mapped." "Hagrid's distraction is active," came McGonagall's voice, tense but controlled. Half the street's lights just went on 2 blocks east. Whatever he's doing with that motorcycle of his is certainly drawing attention. Kingsley's voice cut through the static. Blood Ward Matrix is more complex than we anticipated. Going to need an extra 2 minutes to unravel this without triggering alarms. Remus forced himself to breathe slowly, to maintain the careful control that would be essential for what came next. Through the darkness, he could see the faint shimmer of protective magic surrounding number 4 Privet Drive, layers upon layers of monitoring charms, containment spells, and blood magic all woven together into a net designed to keep Harry Potter exactly where Dumbledore wanted him. Multiple ward anchors identified, Kingsley continued, his voice tight with concentration. This isn't just protection magic, it's a supernatural prison. The containment elements are keyed specifically to magical signatures matching the Potter bloodline. Meaning Harry literally cannot leave this house through magical means while these wards are active. No apparition, no portkey, no emergency transportation of any kind. If he'd tried to escape on his own? The implication hung in the air like a curse. Even if Harry had somehow recognized his situation as wrong, even if he'd somehow accessed help, the very protections meant to keep him safe would have prevented his rescue. Can you break them? Remus asked. Turns I can break them. But the moment I do, every magical monitoring device within 50 miles is going to scream. We'll have maybe 10 minutes before every aura in London descends on this location. Then we make those 10 minutes count. Do it! The change in the air was immediate and unmistakable. The oppressive weight of layered magic suddenly lifted, like stepping out of a suffocating room into fresh air. But with that relief came an awareness that they were now operating on borrowed time. Wards down, Kingsley reported. Clock is ticking. Remus moved through the darkness toward number 4 with the silent grace of a predator, every sense alert for signs of additional protection or unexpected resistance. The front door was locked, but a simple Alohomora took care of that obstacle. As he stepped across the threshold, the house's interior magic washed over him. Not protection now, but monitoring spells designed to track every movement, every magical signature that entered this space. Too late to matter now. The house was exactly as ordinary as it appeared from the outside. Bland furniture, beige walls, the kind of aggressive normalcy that made Remus's skin crawl. Family photos lined the hallway, all featuring Vernon, Petunia, and their chubby son, Dudley. Harry was absent from every image, as if he didn't exist at all. Remus climbed the stairs toward the small room they'd identified during surveillance, his heart hammering with each step. Behind one of these doors was James and Lily's son, alone and afraid, and completely unaware that rescue was finally coming. The door to Harry's room was smaller than the others, depainted in the same beige as the rest of the house, but somehow managing to look even more unwelcoming. Remus turned the handle slowly, wincing as it creaked in the night silence. What he found inside made his blood turn to ice. The room was barely large enough for its contents. A crib that looked like it had been salvaged from a charity shop, a small dresser with peeling paint, and nothing else. No toys, no books, no decorations of any kind. The walls were bare, except for water stains that suggested the room had never been properly maintained. It was less a nursery than a storage closet someone had reluctantly converted when forced to house an unwanted burden. And in the crib, curled under a thin blanket that looked like it had seen better decades, was Harry Potter. Remus approached slowly, trying to process what he was seeing. Harry was awake, had probably been awakened by the sound of footsteps, and was staring up at him with eyes that were far too solemn for a 15-month-old child. Those eyes, so much like Lily's but already carrying shadows that spoke of treatment no child should endure. Harry was small. Not just small for his age, but genuinely malnourished, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that should have been chubby with toddler fat. His hair, that distinctive Potter mess, was clean enough, but everything else about him spoke of minimal care, of a child being kept alive but not cherished. "Hello, Harry," Remus whispered, his voice catching despite his efforts to stay controlled. I'm Remus. I knew your mummy and daddy." At the word mummy, Harry's expression changed. Not recognition. He'd been too young when Lily died for that. But something else. Or hope, perhaps. Or simply the desperate longing of a child who'd learned not to expect comfort, but still craved it. Remus reached into the crib and gently lifted Harry out, expecting the resistance or fear that most children showed when handled by strangers. Instead, Harry settled against his chest with the boneless trust of someone who was simply grateful to be held. When was the last time someone had picked him up just to comfort him? That's when Remus felt it, the faint but unmistakable magical resonance that surrounded Harry like a second skin. Not the dangerous, unstable magic of an untrained wizard, but something else. Something that felt like barely contained power wrapped in layers of fear and suppression. "My God," he breathed, understanding finally hitting him like a physical blow. "And what have they done to you?" "Remus," McGonagall's voice in his earpiece was sharp with urgency. "We've got movement. Someone's coming up the front walk." Through Harry's small window, Remus could see lights coming on throughout the neighborhood. Hagrid's distraction had worked too well. Half of Privet Drive was awake and investigating the commotion, and walking purposefully toward number 4, his robes billowing in the night wind, was a figure that made Remus's heart sink. Dumbledore. "He's here," Remus reported, clutching Harry closer. "Dumbledore's here." "Front door moving fast," Mad-Eye confirmed. "And he's not alone. Count at least 3 others with him. Looks like Order members." The sound of the front door slamming open echoed through the house, followed immediately by heavy footsteps on the stairs. Remus looked around the tiny room, assessing his options. One window, too small for easy escape. One door, now blocked by approaching enemies. And in his arms, a child who didn't understand what was happening, but seemed to sense the danger. Harry had begun to tremble, his small hands clutching at Remus's robes. "Remus Lupin," Dumbledore's voice carried clearly through the house, calm and controlled, and absolutely implacable. "I know you're here. I know what you've done. This ends now." The bedroom door burst open, and Dumbledore stepped inside, flanked by 2 Order members Remus didn't immediately recognize. The headmaster looked exactly as he always did, serene, grandfatherly, radiating the kind of benevolent authority that had convinced an entire generation to follow him into war. But his eyes, those blue eyes that had always seemed so wise, now held something cold and calculating. "Give me the child, Remus." No. It was a simple word, but it carried 15 months of growing horror, days of investigation, hours of planning, and the weight of a promise made to friends who'd died trusting the wrong person. Harry shifted in Remus's arms, and he could feel the boy's magic responding to the tension in the room. Not with fear, but with something that felt almost like recognition. "You don't understand the forces you're meddling with," Dumbledore continued, stepping further into the room. "Harry's protection depends on his remaining here, with his family. His safety, his torture, you mean?" Remus backed toward the window, knowing it was a futile gesture, but unwilling to surrender without making Dumbledore work for his prize. "I've read your notes, Albus. I know what you've done to him, what you're still doing to him." Something flickered in Dumbledore's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe just disappointment that his careful plans had been discovered. "The greater good requires difficult choices, Remus. Sacrifices that—" "He's 15 months old." The words tore out of Remus's throat with more force than he'd intended, and Harry whimpered at the sound. "He's a baby, and you've been systematically torturing him since the day you placed him here. I've been preparing him for the role he must play. The prophecy. The prophecy doesn't require him to suffer. That's your choice. Your decision that a child should be broken down and rebuilt into the perfect weapon." Footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of additional forces. McGonagall appeared in the doorway, her face pale with fury as she took in the scene. The tiny, barren room. Harry's obvious malnutrition, the clinical coldness of a space meant to house but never nurture. "Dear God, Albus," she whispered, "what have you done?" "What was necessary," Dumbledore replied, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Minerva, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly." McGonagall's voice was diamond hard. "I understand that you've taken a child, a baby, and deliberately placed him in a situation designed to break his spirit. I understand that you've been documenting his abuse like a research project. I understand that everything we fought for in the war, every principle we claimed to defend, has been perverted in service of your grand design." Behind them, Kingsley and Mad-Eye appeared, though their wands drawn and their expressions grim. The small room was suddenly crowded with competing loyalties and decades of accumulated trust colliding with present horror. "Stand down, all of you," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "Return the child to his crib and leave this house immediately. Your interference has already compromised his protection beyond—" "His protection?" Mad-Eye's scarred face twisted into something that might have been a smile. "You call this protection? This cell? This deliberate neglect? This systematic conditioning? I've seen dark wizards show more mercy to their prisoners." Harry had gone very still in Remus's arms, his green eyes fixed on Dumbledore with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone his age. And as the tension in the room ratcheted higher, as voices rose and wands were drawn, something extraordinary began to happen. The air around Harry started to shimmer. It wasn't the wild, uncontrolled magic typical of accidental incidents. This was something else, focused, responsive, almost as if Harry were instinctively reaching for power he didn't yet know how to use. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and frost began to form on the windows. "Remarkable," Dumbledore breathed, his anger temporarily forgotten in the face of this display. "The power levels are far beyond what I projected for his age. The conditioning is working even better than—" He never finished the sentence. McGonagall's stunner hit him square in the chest, sending him stumbling backward into the hallway. The two Order members with him spun toward her, the wands rising, but found themselves facing Mad-Eye and Kingsley's drawn weapons. "You want him so badly," McGonagall said, her voice deadly quiet as she kept her wand trained on Dumbledore. "Come and take him. But you'll have to go through all of us first." The magical battle that followed was brief but devastating. Spells flew in the narrow hallway, defensive shields shattered and reformed, and the house shook under the impact of forces that hadn't been unleashed since the war's end. Through it all, Remus held Harry close, shielding him from the chaos while trying to find an escape route that wouldn't require him to abandon his allies. But Harry himself seemed strangely calm now, his small hands still gripping Remus's robes, but his expression alert rather than afraid. As if he somehow understood that this violence, and unlike the cold cruelty he'd endured for months, was being directed toward his protection rather than his destruction. The battle ended when Hagrid's massive form filled the stairway, his pink umbrella pointed directly at Dumbledore's chest. "That's enough!" the gamekeeper rumbled, his voice carrying authority that had nothing to do with magical power and everything to do with moral certainty. "I carried this boy out of his parents' ruins, and I'll be damned if I let anyone send him back to a place that's killing him by inches." Dumbledore looked around at the faces surrounding him, people who had followed him through a war, who had trusted him with their lives and the lives of their loved ones, who were now standing against him, with wands drawn and judgment in their eyes. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said finally. Harry's destiny, Remus interrupted, "is his own to choose. Just like his parents wanted." He stepped past Dumbledore, through the wreckage of the hallway, toward the stairs that led to freedom. McGonagall fell in beside him, then Kingsley, then Mad-Eye, their wands still drawn but pointed now toward the man they'd once followed without question. At the front door, Remus paused and looked back, Dumbledore stood alone in the ruins of his carefully constructed plan, surrounded by the evidence of what his vision of the greater good had required. For just a moment, he looked not like the most powerful wizard of his age, but like an old man who had lost everything that mattered in pursuit of something that might never have been worth the cost. "This isn't over, Remus," Dumbledore said quietly. "Harry Potter has a role to play in what's coming. With or without your cooperation, he will fulfill his destiny." "Maybe," Remus replied, Harry warm and solid in his arms. "But he'll face it as someone who knows he's loved, not as someone who's been broken into accepting martyrdom as his only option." Outside, the November night felt like freedom. They had Harry Potter, and for the first time since this began, Remus believed they might actually be able to save him. But as they disappeared into the darkness, leaving Privet Drive and its artificial normalcy behind, he knew that Dumbledore had been right about one thing. This was far from over. The war for Harry Potter's soul had only just begun. To Chapter 10. The Price of Defiance. The safe house Kingsley had arranged in the Welsh countryside looked nothing like the cramped London flat they'd been using. This was a proper farmhouse, hidden in a valley that existed on no Muggle maps, and protected by wards so old they'd been woven into the very stones of the foundation. It was the kind of place where someone could disappear completely from the wizarding world, which, Remus was beginning to understand, might be exactly what they needed to do. Harry sat in McGonagall's lap by the fireplace, gnawing on a piece of bread with the single-minded focus that only very hungry children possessed. He'd been eating almost constantly since they'd brought him here 12 hours ago, as if his body was trying to make up for months of inadequate nutrition. Nor the healing charms McGonagall had cast had addressed the most immediate concerns: malnutrition, minor illnesses, the kind of neglect-related ailments that spoke of systematic indifference to a child's basic needs. But there were some things that magic couldn't fix overnight, like the way Harry flinched when anyone moved too quickly around him, or how he hoarded food, cramming it into his mouth as if expecting it to be taken away at any moment, or the way he watched doors with the wariness of someone who'd learned that people entering rooms meant unpleasant things were about to happen. "He's so small," McGonagall murmured, running gentle fingers through Harry's impossibly messy hair. 15 months old, and he weighs less than most children half his age. "He'll recover," Remus said, though he wasn't entirely certain. But some kinds of damage ran deeper than the physical. "Give him time, proper care, people who love him. He'll get stronger. If we have time." Mad-Eye's voice cut through the domestic tranquility from his position by the window, where he'd been maintaining watch since they'd arrived. "Daily Prophet's morning edition just arrived by owl. We made the front page." He tossed the paper onto the table, and Remus felt his stomach drop as he read the blazing headline: "Kidnapping at Privet Drive. Boy who lived taken by rogue elements." The article was everything Remus had feared and worse. According to the Prophet's account, a group of disgruntled former Order members had orchestrated the kidnapping of Harry Potter from his loving relatives, possibly in service of dark wizard sympathizers seeking to claim the famous child for their own purposes. The piece quoted several unnamed ministry sources expressing concern about Harry's safety and calling for the immediate arrest of those responsible. But it was the smaller article on page 3 that made Remus's blood run cold. Under the headline, "Ministry Declares Emergency Custody Measures," the piece detailed temporary legislation that had been rushed through the Wizengamot in an emergency session the previous evening. The law granted the ministry broad powers to assume custody of magically significant minors whose welfare was deemed at risk, with the authority to place such children in protective care pending resolution of custody disputes. "Dumbledore's been busy," Kingsley said grimly from the kitchen, where he'd been making tea and monitoring ministry communications through his official channels. The emergency legislation went through with almost no debate. Whoever drafted it knew exactly what they wanted, and had the political capital to make it happen quickly. "How quickly?" Remus asked. "The bill was introduced at 9 o'clock last night. barely 6 hours after we extracted Harry. It passed final reading at 2 in the morning. Kingsley brought tea to the table, his expression troubled. No one moves legislation through the Wizengamot that fast, unless they've been planning for months and have significant support already lined up. The implications were staggering. Dumbledore hadn't just anticipated that someone might try to rescue Harry. He'd prepared legal mechanisms to reclaim him immediately if they succeeded. The entire system, from the ministry bureaucracy to the Wizengamot itself, had been prepared to support his plans. But there's more, Kingsley continued. I've been going through ministry files all morning, using my Auror clearance to trace back some of the decisions made regarding the Potter family's protection. What I've found suggests that Dumbledore's influence extends much further than any of us realized. He pulled out a stack of documents and spread them across the table. Protection detail requests for the Potters that were declined by unnamed advisors to the minister. Safe house assignments that were mysteriously reassigned to other families. Intelligence reports about Death Eater activities that were classified at levels requiring Dumbledore's personal approval. Remus scanned the papers, his horror growing with each page. He controlled every aspect of their protection. Not just controlled, orchestrated. Look at this. Kingsley pointed to a memo dated 3 weeks before the Potter's death. Intelligence suggesting that Pettigrew might have been compromised, filed by an Auror named Williams. The memo was classified and buried, never acted upon. Someone in the ministry knew Peter might be a traitor. Someone suspected it. But the information never reached anyone who could act on it, because Dumbledore had it suppressed. Kingsley's voice was tight with controlled anger. He knew Peter was vulnerable to turning, and he let it happen because it served his purposes. Across the room, Harry had finished his bread and was now playing with a set of wooden blocks McGonagall had conjured for him. But even his play was subdued, careful, as if he was afraid that too much noise or enthusiasm might bring punishment. Watching him, Remus felt rage burn in his chest like acid. This was what Dumbledore's grand strategy had required, the systematic destruction of a child's spirit in service of prophecy. We can't stay here, he said suddenly. If Dumbledore has this much influence over the ministry, if he can pass emergency legislation overnight and suppress intelligence reports, then nowhere in Britain is safe. I've been thinking the same thing, McGonagall said quietly. She'd been holding Harry while they talked, and now she looked down at the child in her arms with an expression that mixed love and fierce protectiveness. But leaving Britain means leaving everything. Our homes, our careers, our entire lives. What careers? Mad-Eye asked with bitter humour. I just went rogue against the ministry I've served for 30 years, and Kingsley's about to be investigated for misuse of his Auror clearance. And you? He looked at McGonagall. What do you think happens to your position at Hogwarts when Dumbledore realizes you've chosen sides? McGonagall was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still stroking Harry's hair. When she spoke, her voice was steady with decision. I submitted my resignation this morning, effective immediately. The words hit the room like a thunderclap. McGonagall had been at Hogwarts for decades, had built her entire adult life around the school and her role as deputy headmistress. For her to walk away from all of that. Minerva, Remus said softly. You don't have to. Yes, I do. Her voice carried the kind of certainty that came from moral clarity rather than easy choice. I cannot continue to work for an institution led by someone who would systematically torture a child for strategic advantage. I cannot pretend to teach about justice and courage and love while serving under someone who perverts all those ideals. She pulled out a scroll and handed it to Remus. This is a copy of my resignation letter. I've been quite specific about my reasons for leaving. I suspect it will be the last honest thing published about this situation for quite some time. Remus read the letter, his eyebrows rising with each paragraph. McGonagall hadn't simply resigned. She'd written a comprehensive indictment of Dumbledore's manipulation, documenting everything from the deliberate placement with abusive relatives to the suppression of intelligence that might have saved the Potters' lives. It was the kind of letter that would end careers and shatter reputations, assuming anyone was allowed to read it. "You know he'll suppress this," Remus said. "Use his influence to bury it or discredit it." "I'm counting on him trying," McGonagall replied with a smile that held no warmth. "Because I've sent copies to every major newspaper in Britain, to several foreign publications, and to the International Confederation of Wizards. Let him try to suppress them all." The implications were staggering. McGonagall hadn't just resigned, she'd declared war. Her letter would force public attention onto questions that Dumbledore had hoped to handle quietly through legal and political channels, but it also meant that they were now beyond any hope of reconciliation or compromise. The Dumbledore would use every resource at his disposal to destroy them before they could destroy him. "We need to leave," Remus said again. "Not just Britain, Europe entirely. Somewhere Dumbledore's influence doesn't reach. Somewhere we can disappear completely." "Australia," Hagrid said suddenly from the corner where he'd been sitting quietly with Fang. "Got a cousin there. Works with magical creatures in the outback. Says it's a good place for people who want to start over." "Too obvious," Mad-Eye countered. "First place Dumbledore would look. We need somewhere unexpected. Somewhere none of us have connections that could be traced." "What about America?" Kingsley suggested. "The magical communities there are more isolated from European politics. And they've got their own problems with their government. They might be sympathetic to refugees from ministry persecution." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, weighing options, considering the logistics of disappearing 4 adults and 1 traumatized toddler from the most connected magical community in the world. It was a daunting prospect. Not just the practical difficulties, but the emotional cost of leaving behind everything they'd ever known. But watching Harry play with his blocks, seeing the way he tensed whenever anyone raised their voice or moved too quickly, Remus knew they had no choice. This child had already paid too high a price for adult ambitions and political games. Whatever it took to give him a chance at a normal life, free from prophecies and destinies and the weight of other people's expectations, it would be worth it. "There's something else we need to consider," McGonagall said, as their planning continued. "Harry's magic." She gestured to where Harry was playing, and Remus followed her gaze to see something extraordinary. The wooden blocks weren't just stacked, they were floating, held in elaborate patterns by Harry's unconscious magic. The display was far beyond anything a 15-month-old should be capable of, even one with Harry's heritage. "The power levels I detected during the confrontation last night," McGonagall continued, "the way he responded to the magical combat around him. This isn't normal, accidental magic. It's something else entirely." "The conditioning," Remus said with growing understanding. "Dumbledore wasn't just breaking him down psychologically. He was doing something to his magic as well." "Suppression and release," McGonagall agreed. "Months of forcing Harry to associate his magical abilities with punishment and fear, building up pressure until the magic had to find other outlets. What we're seeing now, this unconscious display of power, it's his magic responding to the first environment where he's felt safe enough to let it show." The floating blocks suddenly collapsed, as Harry became aware that the adults were watching him. He looked around fearfully, as if expecting punishment for the magical display, and Remus felt his heart break a little more. Even here, surrounded by people who loved him, Harry was still afraid to be magical. "He'll learn," McGonagall said softly, reaching out to reassure Harry that he wasn't in trouble. "Given time and patience and love, or he'll learn that his magic is a gift, not a curse. But it will take time to undo the damage that's been done." "Time we'll have," Remus said with determination. "Wherever we end up, whatever new lives we build, Harry will have the time he needs to heal, to be a child instead of a symbol, to choose his own path instead of following one someone else laid out for him." Outside, the Welsh countryside stretched away in all directions, green and peaceful and normal. Somewhere in London, Dumbledore was probably marshalling his forces, calling in favours, using every ounce of his considerable influence to track them down. The ministry was mobilising, the press was spinning stories, and the entire wizarding world was being told that they were the villains in this narrative. But here, in this hidden valley, surrounded by people who had chosen principle over politics and love over law, Harry Potter was learning what it meant to be safe. And for Remus, that was worth any price they might have to pay. Tomorrow they would begin the journey that would take them away from everything they'd ever known. Tonight, they would hold vigil over a child who was finally beginning to understand that he was loved. The war for Harry Potter's soul was far from over. But for the first time since it began, Remus believed they might actually be winning. Chapter 11. A New Path Forward. The cottage sat on a hillside, overlooking a highland loch, so perfectly isolated that it seemed to exist in a world apart from the rest of Scotland. Ancient stone walls weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain, dead windows that caught the morning light like eyes full of secrets, and a garden that had been left to grow wild until it was indistinguishable from the moorland that surrounded it. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could disappear from history, which was precisely what they needed. Remus stood at the edge of what would become Harry's new world, watching the 15-month-old explore the cottage's front garden with the careful wonder of a child who was still learning that exploration wouldn't bring punishment. 3 days had passed since they'd left the Welsh safe house. 3 days of careful travel through back roads and forgotten paths, using every trick Mad-Eye had learned in 30 years of hunting dark wizards to ensure they left no trail that could be followed. Now, finally, they were home. "The wards are holding beautifully," McGonagall reported, emerging from the cottage with her sleeves rolled up and satisfaction in her voice. "Hagrid's earth magic, combined with Kingsley's aura protections and my own transfigurative reinforcements. I don't think there's another place in Britain better hidden from unwanted attention." "What about wanted attention?" Remus asked, gesturing toward Harry, who was attempting to climb onto a low stone wall with the determination that characterized all toddler endeavors. He's going to need more than just hiding. Medical care, education, social interaction, all the things children require to grow up whole. "There's a magical community about 20 miles south," Kingsley said, consulting the detailed maps they'd been studying for days. "Small, isolated. They're mostly families who wanted to get away from the politics and pressures of modern wizarding society. They have a healer, a small school, everything Harry will need when he's older. And they won't ask questions about a group of strangers who show up with a famous child?" "They will," Mad-Eye said grimly from his position by the cottage door, magical eye spinning as he maintained his constant surveillance. "But they're also the kind of people who understand that sometimes asking questions gets innocent people killed. They've been protecting their own secrets for generations. They'll help us protect ours." Harry had succeeded in climbing onto the wall and was now sitting with his legs dangling, looking out over the loch with an expression of profound contentment. It was the first time since they'd rescued him that he'd seemed genuinely relaxed, free from the hypervigilance that had characterized his behavior at Privet Drive. Here, surrounded by people who loved him, and landscape that stretched to the horizons without a single suburban house in sight, he was beginning to remember how to be a child. "We'll need new names," McGonagall said practically. "New identities, new histories. Harry especially. He's too recognizable as he is." "James Evans," Remus said without hesitation. "Lily's maiden name, but common enough not to draw attention. And we'll call him Jamie until he's old enough to choose for himself whether he wants to reclaim Harry Potter." The choice felt right in a way that went beyond practical necessity. James and Lily had died protecting their son's right to choose his own path. Using their names to give him that choice seemed like the kind of memorial they would have wanted. "Remus Evans, then," McGonagall said with a slight smile. "His uncle, recently moved to Scotland for his health. Minerva Campbell, old family friend, helping with childcare. Kingsley MacLeod, security consultant. Hagrid. She paused, looking at the gamekeeper's massive form. Hagrid will be more difficult to disguise. Hagrid Frazier, the gamekeeper rumbled. Brother moved up from Yorkshire, bought a bit of land to raise magical creatures away from ministry interference. Not uncommon in these parts. They spent the afternoon making lists, planning identities, discussing the mundane details that would allow them to build new lives in their chosen exile. Their birth certificates would need to be forged, employment histories created, references established. It was painstaking work, but necessary. One slip, one inconsistency that caught the wrong person's attention, and Dumbledore would find them. As evening settled over the loch, they gathered in the cottage's main room for what felt like the first normal family dinner any of them had experienced in months. Harry sat in a high chair Hagrid had carved from local oak, demolishing a bowl of stew with the enthusiasm of a child who was no longer afraid his food would be taken away. Around the table, the adults who had risked everything to save him planned the details of the life they were going to give him. "Education will be crucial," McGonagall said, watching Harry attempt to use a spoon with variable success. Or not just magical education. He'll need to understand both worlds, be comfortable in both. But carefully, gradually, without the pressure and expectations that come with being Harry Potter. "What about his parents?" Remus asked. "When he's old enough to ask questions, to want to know who he really is." McGonagall reached into her robes and pulled out Lily's diary, its leather cover worn smooth from handling. "We tell him the truth, all of it. Who his parents were, how much they loved him, what they died trying to protect. We show him his mother's words. Let him read for himself how she fought to save him from the destiny others had chosen for him. And Dumbledore? The prophecy? The whole mess we've pulled him away from? We give him the facts and let him make his own choices. When he's old enough to understand. Or when he's had time to grow up loved and confident and free, he can decide for himself what role, if any, he wants to play in the wizarding world's future." McGonagall's voice was firm with conviction. "That's what his parents wanted. That's what we owe them." Kingsley looked up from the intelligence reports he'd been reviewing. "Speaking of the wizarding world's future, we need to maintain some kind of monitoring capability. Voldemort is gone, but gone doesn't necessarily mean dead. If he finds a way to return, he won't be returning to find a weapon ready-made for his destruction," Mad-Eye said with satisfaction. "By the time that particular Dark Lord pulls himself back together, if he ever does, Harry Potter will be Jamie Evans, a young man who's had the luxury of growing up normal." "Normal?" Remus laughed, as though not without affection. "With his magical inheritance, with us for family, I think normal might be optimistic." Harry chose that moment to accidentally levitate his spoon, sending it spinning through the air to land in McGonagall's teacup with a small splash. Instead of the fear and distress that such magical incidents had triggered at Privet Drive, he giggled with delight at the effect. "Different normal, then," McGonagall said, fishing the spoon out of her tea with an indulgent smile. "The kind of normal where magical children get to explore their abilities without fear, where they're celebrated for their gifts instead of punished for them." Later, after Harry had been bathed and put to bed in the small room they'd prepared for him, a real nursery this time, with toys and books and windows that looked out over the loch, the adults gathered around the fireplace to discuss the larger implications of their choice. "We can't go back," Remus said quietly. "Even if we wanted to, even if circumstances changed, we can never return to the wizarding world as the people we were before." "Good," McGonagall said firmly. "The people we were before stood aside and let children be sacrificed for political expediency. I have no interest in returning to that life." "But we'll be cut off," Kingsley pointed out. "No contact with friends, colleagues, the communities we spent our lives building. No way to know what's happening in the world we left behind." "We'll find ways to stay informed without exposing ourselves," Mad-Eye said. I've got contacts throughout Britain and Europe, of people who owe me favors and don't ask uncomfortable questions. We won't be blind to external threats." Hagrid leaned back in his oversized chair, Fang curled up at his feet. "Been thinking about that," he said slowly. "About threats and such. What happens if Voldemort does come back someday? What happens if the prophecy was real and Harry really is the only one who can stop him?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace. It was the fear none of them wanted to voice, that by saving Harry from Dumbledore's manipulation, they might have doomed the wizarding world to a future dominated by darkness. Then Harry, Jamie, will face that choice when he's old enough to make it with full knowledge of what it means, Remus said finally. Not as a broken child who's been conditioned to accept martyrdom, but as a young man who knows he's loved and valued for more than his ability to die for other people's causes. And if he chooses not to fight, if he decides his own life and happiness matter more than some ancient prophecy? Remus thought about Lily's diary, about the months of anguish she'd documented as she watched Dumbledore position her family for sacrifice, about James's growing doubts, about their desperate attempt to find another way, about their willingness to defy the most powerful wizard of their age to protect their son's right to choose. "Then that's his choice to make," he said, "and I'll be proud of him for making it, because it means we succeeded in giving him something his parents died trying to protect, the freedom to be something other than a symbol." Outside, the Highland wind swept across the moor, carrying with it the sense of heather and clean water, and the kind of peace that came from being far from the machinations of political power. Inside the cottage, Harry Potter slept in a room designed for love rather than containment, watched over by people who had chosen exile over complicity, freedom over duty. The war for his soul wasn't over, might not be over for years to come. But for the first time since his parents' death, Harry Potter was winning it. And tomorrow, when Jamie Evans woke up to explore his new world, he would do so as a child who was loved unconditionally, protected fiercely, and free to become whoever he chose to be. In a small room off the cottage's main corridor, Lily's diary sat on a shelf beside a growing collection of books about childhood development, magical education, and trauma recovery. Someday, or when he was ready, Jamie would read his mother's words and understand the price that had been paid for his freedom. But until then, he would have something Lily had dreamed of giving him, a childhood filled with love, wonder, and the radical possibility that his destiny was his own to write. The loch reflected the first stars of evening, and somewhere in London, Dumbledore was probably planning new strategies to reclaim his weapon. But here, in this hidden corner of Scotland, Harry Potter was finally safe to be exactly what his parents had always wanted him to be, their beloved child, free to choose his own path. And that, Remus thought as he banked the fire and prepared for sleep, was a victory worth any price they might have to pay. Chapter 12. Legacy of Truth. July 31st, 1982. The morning sun painted the loch in shades of gold and rose, and from his seat on the cottage's front porch, Remus could hear the sound that had become the most precious thing in his world, Harry's laughter echoing from the garden behind the house. Today marked 8 months since they'd pulled him from that storage room in Little Whinging, 8 months since they'd chosen love over loyalty and hope over duty. And today, Harry Potter, Jamie Evans to the small Highland community that had embraced them, was celebrating his 2nd birthday. Remus opened Lily's diary to a page he'd read countless times, one of her earlier entries from before the fear and desperation had consumed her words. Written when Harry was just a few months old, it captured everything she'd hoped for her son's future. March 15th, 1981. Asterisk, asterisk. Watched Harry sleep for an hour today, just memorizing his face. James says I'm being silly, that I'll have years and years to watch him sleep. But something in me needs to catalogue every moment. He's so perfect, so full of possibility. When I look at him, I don't see a weapon or a symbol or a savior. I see our son, someone who will grow up to make his own choices, his own mistakes, his own mark on the world. I want him to know kindness before he knows cruelty. I want him to understand love before he encounters hate. I want him to believe in his own worth before anyone tries to convince him that his value lies in what he can sacrifice for others. Most of all, I want him to be free. Free to be ordinary, if that's what makes him happy. Free to be extraordinary, if that's where his heart leads him. Or free to change his mind a dozen times about what kind of person he wants to become. Whatever destiny the world might try to thrust upon him, I want him to know that his life belongs to him first. Is that too much to ask for one small boy? I suppose we'll find out. The sound of running footsteps interrupted his reading, and Remus looked up to see Harry, Jamie, racing around the corner of the cottage with a wooden toy dragon clutched in one chubby hand. At 2 years old, he was everything a healthy toddler should be, bright-eyed, round-cheeked, perpetually in motion, and completely fearless in the way that only children who had never learned to expect punishment could be. "Uncle Mooney," Harry called, using the nickname he'd developed for Remus somewhere around his first word attempts. Dragon flying. Indeed, the wooden dragon was flying, floating about 3 feet above Harry's head in lazy circles, held aloft by the unconscious magic of a child who had learned that miraculous things happened when he was happy rather than afraid. Remus watched with a mixture of pride and wonder as Harry directed the dragon through elaborate aerial maneuvers, his face scrunched in concentration that was far too serious for someone his age. "Very good flying," Remus said, closing the diary and giving Harry his full attention. "Where did you learn to make dragons do loops like that?" "Nana Minnie showed me," Harry said proudly, referring to McGonagall by the name he'd coined when Professor proved too difficult for his developing vocabulary. "She says magic is for happy things." "Nana Minnie is very wise," Remus agreed, catching the dragon as it finally settled back into Harry's hands. "Is she in the garden?" "Making cake with Hagrid." Harry bounced on his toes with excitement. "Birthday cake with lots and lots of frosting." "Ah, the all-important frosting. Well, we can't keep the birthday cake waiting, can we?" Hand in hand, they walked around to the back garden, where a scene of domestic chaos was unfolding that would have been impossible to imagine 9 months ago. McGonagall, her hair pulled back with flower fingerprints and her sleeves rolled to the elbows, was attempting to direct Hagrid's efforts at cake decoration with the patience of someone who had spent decades teaching teenagers. Hagrid, for his part, was applying frosting with the enthusiasm of someone who believed more was always better, creating architectural achievements in buttercream that defied both gravity and good taste. "Happy birthday, little one," McGonagall said, scooping Harry up for a hug that left powdered sugar on his dark hair. 2 years old today. Can you believe it?" Harry held up 2 fingers proudly, then pointed to the cake. "Big cake." "Very big cake," McGonagall agreed. "Hagrid may have gotten a bit carried away with the decorating." "Nonsense," Hagrid protested, adding another tower of frosting to what was already a confectionery castle. "Boy's only got 1 second birthday, doesn't he? Might as well make it memorable." Watching them, Remus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he was struck by how normal this all was, how utterly ordinary and precious and right. Harry arguing with McGonagall about whether he could eat frosting before lunch. Hagrid creating edible architecture that would make a cathedral jealous. The smell of baking bread and blooming heather mixing in the Highland air. It was everything James and Lily had dreamed of for their son, and everything Dumbledore's vision would have denied him. A soft pop announced Kingsley's arrival, apparating just outside the garden wards with the practiced ease of someone who made this journey regularly. But his expression was more serious than usual, and Remus felt a familiar flutter of unease. Once a month, Kingsley used his remaining contacts to gather intelligence about the wizarding world they'd left behind, ensuring they weren't blindsided by threats they couldn't see coming. "Any news?" Remus asked quietly, moving away from where Harry was helping McGonagall taste-test frosting. "Some," Kingsley said, accepting the cup of tea McGonagall wordlessly handed him. "Dumbledore's still looking, but his search efforts have shifted. He's no longer focusing on Britain. Seems to believe you've taken Harry abroad. There's been some reorganization at Hogwarts as well. He's brought in new staff, people with fewer connections to the old order, building a power base that's entirely loyal to him. Preparing for something? That's my impression. There's also been increased activity around sites associated with Voldemort, old hideouts, places where his followers used to meet. Nothing confirmed, but the pattern suggests someone is investigating the possibility of his return." Remus felt ice settle in his stomach. "What, you think he's not as gone as we hoped?" "I think Dumbledore doesn't believe he's as gone as everyone hopes. And if Dumbledore is preparing for Voldemort's return..." Kingsley didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. If the Dark Lord came back, Dumbledore would double his efforts to reclaim Harry, to complete the conditioning that would turn him into the perfect weapon. "Well," McGonagall said briskly from where she'd been listening while ostensibly focused on Harry, "then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For now, Harry is safe, happy, and gloriously normal. That's what matters." Harry chose that moment to demonstrate just how normal he was by attempting to climb onto the garden table to reach the cake, his wooden dragon forgotten on the ground as he pursued more immediate goals. Remus caught him before he could topple the entire confectionery castle, earning a look of profound disappointment. "Cake now?" Harry asked hopefully. "After lunch," McGonagall said firmly. "Birthday cake for dessert, not breakfast." "But it's my birthday," Harry protested, with the irrefutable logic of a 2-year-old. "Yes, and you'll appreciate the cake more if you're not too full to eat it properly," she replied, unmoved by big green eyes and a perfectly executed pout. As they moved inside for lunch, Remus found himself studying Harry's face, looking for signs of the boy he'd been at 15 months, fearful, withdrawn, careful never to ask for too much. That child had vanished completely, replaced by this confident, curious, as occasionally stubborn little person who expected the world to be kind to him because everyone in his world always had been. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. After lunch, they gathered around the kitchen table for the cake ceremony, complete with 2 candles that Harry blew out with such enthusiasm that he nearly extinguished himself. Then came presents, a set of picture books from McGonagall, a hand-carved rocking horse from Hagrid that was only slightly larger than Harry himself, and from Remus, a small photo album filled with pictures of James and Lily. "Who's that?" Harry asked, pointing to the first photograph where James and Lily sat together in the garden at Godric's Hollow, Lily's hand resting on her pregnant belly. Remus had been preparing for this moment for months, at rehearsing how he would begin to tell Harry about his heritage. Not the full truth, that would wait until he was much older, but the foundation upon which that truth would eventually rest. "Those are your mummy and daddy," Remus said gently. "Their names were Lily and James, and they loved you very, very much." Harry studied the photograph with the intense focus he brought to everything that interested him. "Where are they now?" "They had to go away before you were big enough to remember them. But they wanted you to know how much they loved you, so they left these pictures so you could see their faces and know that you were the most important thing in their whole world." It was a carefully crafted explanation, one that conveyed love without fear, loss without trauma, a truth without details that would be too heavy for a 2-year-old to carry. There would be time later for harder questions, for discussions of sacrifice and war and the price of standing against darkness. For now, it was enough that Harry knew he had been wanted, chosen, cherished. Harry turned the page to find a picture of James teaching a much younger Remus to ride a motorbike, both of them grinning at the camera with the careless joy of teenagers who believed the world was full of endless possibilities. "That's you, Uncle Mooney." "Yes, that's me when I was much younger. Your daddy was teaching me to ride Hagrid's motorbike. We were at school together. Your mummy, too. We were all great friends." "Did Mummy and Daddy like dragons?" The question caught Remus off guard for a moment, before he realized Harry was thinking about his wooden toy, about the magic he'd been unconsciously using all day. In Harry's mind, the most important question about his parents was whether they would have approved of the things that made him happy. "Your Mummy and Daddy had magic just like you do," Remus said, pulling out a photograph of Lily making flowers bloom in her hand, while James juggled balls of light. "They thought magic was wonderful, and they would have loved watching you make your dragon fly." Harry beamed at this, then carefully turned through the rest of the album, asking questions about each picture, absorbing stories about parents who existed for him not as tragic figures or martyrs, but as young people who had loved each other and been excited about having a baby and built a life together that had been cut too short. Later, as evening settled over the loch and Harry played with his new toys in front of the fireplace, Remus returned to Lily's diary one more time. He'd saved her final entry for today, the last words she'd written before everything changed. October 30th, 1981. Tomorrow is Halloween, and I can feel something coming. Not magic. Intuition, maybe, or just the paranoia that comes from months of feeling hunted. Whatever happens, I want to leave this record of who we really were, what we really wanted for Harry. We weren't heroes. We were just two people who fell in love and wanted to raise our child in a world where love mattered more than power. If something happens to us, if our choices lead to consequences we can't control, I want Harry to know that we chose love over duty, always. I want him to know that his life has value beyond what he can do for other people, that he deserves happiness not because he's earned it through suffering, but because happiness is the birthright of every child. That the world is beautiful and magic is a gift and people are basically good, even when circumstances make them forget it. Most of all, I want him to know that his story is his own to write. Whatever destiny others might try to impose on him, whatever grand purposes they might claim he's meant to serve, his life belongs to him first. He gets to choose who he becomes, what he values, how he spends the days he's been given. I love my son. I love the man his father is. I love the life we built together, however briefly. If this is my last chance to say it, let it be said. Love is always the right choice. Always. Remus closed the diary and looked across the room to where Harry had fallen asleep against McGonagall's shoulder, the wooden dragon still clutched in his small fist. Tomorrow, Dumbledore would continue his search. Voldemort might edge closer to returning, and the wizarding world would go on spinning its webs of politics and prophecy and power. But tonight, Harry Potter slept peacefully in the arms of someone who loved him, dreaming whatever dreams came to children who had never known fear. And in a few years, when he was old enough to understand, Remus would give him his mother's diary and let him read for himself what love looked like when it chose to defy the world. "He's going to be all right," McGonagall said softly, while stroking Harry's hair as she spoke. "Whatever comes, whoever tries to claim him, he's going to remember this. He's going to remember being loved unconditionally." "Yes," Remus agreed, watching the rise and fall of Harry's small chest, the perfect peace of a child who had never learned to sleep with one ear open for danger. "He's going to be all right." Outside, the Scottish night settled over their hidden valley like a blessing, and somewhere in the darkness, Harry Potter's future spread out before him like an unwritten book. There would be choices to make, challenges to face, probably battles to fight when he was old enough to understand what the world had expected from him, and strong enough to choose his own path instead. But for now, for this perfect moment, suspended between a rescued past and an uncertain future, Harry Potter was exactly what his parents had always wanted him to be, their beloved child, safe and loved, and free to become whoever he chose to be. And that, Remus thought, as he covered the sleeping boy with a soft blanket, was the kind of victory that made every sacrifice worthwhile. What if Petunia Dursley left? Harry on the Weasleys' doorstep, at age 3, and Molly raised him as her 8th child. What if the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry, until Dumbledore answered for what he had done to the boy? What if Hermione used a time-turner, to go back to the night Harry's parents died, and found Dumbledore already there watching what? If Minerva McGonagall quit Hogwarts, at age 60, and raised Harry in a cottage in Scotland, far from Dumbledore's control, what if Sirius Black and Fleur Delacour arrived at the Dursleys? On the same night, both determined to take Harry and never bring him back. What if Cedric Diggory survived the graveyard, and testified that Dumbledore knew the tournament was a trap? What if Bill Weasley broke every ward Dumbledore had placed on Privet Drive, and found dark magic that should never have been nearer? Child, what if Hermione found a locked room in Hogwarts that contained every child Dumbledore had sacrificed before? Harry, what if Severus Snape took Harry the night Lily died and raised him in Spinner's End without telling a soul? What if Victor Crumb offered Harry asylum in Bulgaria after the Triwizard Tournament and Hermione helped him escape? What if Harry walked out of Hogwarts in front of the entire school at age 12 and Snape was the one who held the door open? What if Pansy Parkinson overheard Dumbledore's plan in the dungeons and warned Harry before it was too late? What if Lily Potter left a second letter, hidden in Gringotts, and it named every person Dumbledore told her to trust? What if Amelia Bones launched a full investigation into Dumbledore after Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire? What if the Hogwarts portraits was alive during Harry's trial, and every former headmaster testified against Dumbledore? What if Neville Longbottom's grandmother, Augusta, demanded Harry be placed with her after she learned what the Dursleys had done? What if Draco Malfoy switched sides at age 13 after watching Dumbledore send Harry into the Chamber of Secrets alone? What if Arthur Weasley found Dumbledore's name on a ministry surveillance order for Harry, filed the day after Lily James died? What if the Goblin Nation declared Harry a protected ward of Gringotts and told Dumbledore he had no authority over the Potter vaults? What if Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry during a routine Auror check on Privet Drive and reported the Dursleys to the Ministry? What if Remus Lupin found Lily's diary in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, and every entry was about Dumbledore's demands? What if Madame Pomfrey documented every injury? Harry arrived with each September and handed the file to the Wizengamot. What if Blaise Zabini and Hermione Granger formed a secret alliance in 3rd year to get Harry out of Dumbledore's grip? What if Neville Longbottom was the boy who lived instead, and Harry grew up free until Dumbledore came looking for him? At age 14, what if every Hogwarts student in Harry's year signed a petition against Dumbledore, and Luna Lovegood delivered it to the Daily Prophet? What if Fleur Delacour brought the French ministry's auras to Hogwarts after the 3rd task, and demanded Harry be released into her custody? What if Dobby smuggled Harry out of Privet Drive at age 6 and hid him in the room of requirement for 5 years? Before Hogwarts, what if Winky the House Elf testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch Sr. knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along?